and our housing associations. So they will be a part of the partnership in the future, and I look forward to working with her for her constituency.
Patrick Hurley.
11, Mr Speaker.
To be frank, Mr Speaker, the current system is focused on the problems of yesterday. In the last Parliament, economic inactivity increased and the employment rate fell. We are planning fundamental reforms to the system that will focus on the problems of today and get more people into work, details of which will be set out in our forthcoming white paper, Get Britain Working.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister for his response. I'd like to ask about the proposed merger between Job Centre Plus and the National Careers Service. Specifically, could the Minister set out how that proposed merger will help to tackle economic inactivity and to change the way that we see job centres work with their customers?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question? I was pleased to hear that one of his earliest visits as the first ever Labour member for Southport was to his local job centre with the Minister for Employment, who I know would want me to take the opportunity to commend all of the staff at the Southport Job Centre. The truth is that at present, job centres can seem to function more as places from which benefits are administered than as centres supporting people into work. The merger of Job Centre Plus and the National Careers Service will address this, enabling us to get more people into employment and helping those on low pay increase their earnings through more personalised and localised support, ensuring nobody is left behind.
Tim Farrell.
Speaker, the challenge that the job centres in Kendal and the rest of Cumbria face, as well as getting people back into work, is simply the fact that our workforce in Westmorland is simply far too small. We have an average house price in our constituency of 12 times average earnings and waiting lists for social housing, which is through the roof. If we want to tackle the problem in our economy, and 66% of all employers surveyed in our community recently said they were working below capacity because they couldn't find enough staff, what we really need to do is two things. One is to increase the amount of social housing we've got, and secondly is to allow more flexible visa arrangements. So would his department work with colleagues in housing to provide more housing grant for our communities and sign up to youth mobility visa arrangements?
I think the honourable member should know better. He does get in a lot, so don't take advantage of other members. Come on.
The honourable gentleman will be pleased to know that we do intend to work considerably more flexibly to support the needs of communities in a varied and, particularly bespoke way. He does have particular challenges because of the rural nature of his constituency and various other factors. But what he will appreciate is that I am not going to make housing or Home Office policy on the hoof from the dispatch box today.
Shadow Minister Mims Davies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Job centres are extremely good. We just heard from the Honourable Lady from Hackney South in Shoreditch as she leaves the chamber. Yet, Mr Speaker, the new Minister for Employment previously described job centres as places nobody wants to go and claimed they don't offer real help. Our job centres helped ensure almost 4 million more people have work compared to when her party left office in 2010. Over 2 million of those employed are women. Will the Minister and the team of DWP ministers who've made disparaging remarks apologise to work coaches and DWP staff who she and they have rubbished, who will now have to look up to her and them as the new ministerial team?
They want change.
I fear, Mr Speaker, that the honourable lady has misunderstood the criticism which is levied not at our outstanding work coaches, but at the policies of the party opposite, who have left us in a position where economic inactivity is at the highest rate in years, and we are the only G7 economy with a lower employment rate than since before the pandemic. These are the challenges that we have been left with. These are the problems that we will solve.
Speaker.
Mr Speaker, provider guidance published on gov.uk makes clear that contractors on all of our employment programmes must reimburse customers reasonable travel costs.
Josh Dewberry.
I thank the Minister for that response, because my constituent Connor is in this predicament where he's out of pocket for taxi fares to weekly or even twice weekly sessions with a job centre private contractor. Connor told me that these sessions barely last 15 minutes and they aren't helping him reach his goal of becoming a mechanical engineering apprentice. So can I ask the Minister if he will review the value of job centre plus private contracts to both job seekers and taxpayers?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Of course, performance is reviewed regularly. There are customer satisfaction surveys to check on satisfaction, but I would say that unlike the last government, this one wants to publish performance data so that everybody can see what's going on.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his response to that answer? I think, Minister, everyone wishes to see those claimants being able to get job opportunities, number one, and then to not find themselves in a financial mucks, which they do because of having to pay out for travel costs whenever they should be reimbursed. In Northern Ireland and my constituency, it's a big issue. Can the Minister help directly for those constituents who have been disadvantaged accordingly? Thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I'm not familiar with the arrangements in Northern Ireland, but certainly in the UK, it is very clear that contractors need to reimburse those costs, ideally pay up front, buy the tickets and give them to the job seeker before they embark on their journey, or if not, reimburse them very quickly on production of a receipt.
Torsten Bell.
13, Mr. Speaker.
Tackling child poverty is a top priority of the new government and a personal priority for me, because you can't fulfil your potential without food in your belly or a decent roof over your head, and we can't fill our potential as a country when the talents of so many are being left behind. That's why our new Child Poverty Task Force will drive action across every area of government to drive up family income, drive down family costs, and give every child the best start in life.
Torsten Bell.
Mr. Speaker, and can I welcome the establishment of the Child Poverty Task Force? Can I ask the Secretary of State how we'll ensure that the task force will ensure that lessons, including the role of housing costs in driving up relative poverty and the necessity of growth to drive down absolute poverty, will be learned from previous attempts to drive down child poverty in Wales and across the UK?
My honourable friend makes a very important point about learning the lessons from the last time where we were in government and lifted more than 600,000 children out of poverty, to look at the similarities and differences, not least that there are more children growing up in poverty in households where there's in the private rented sector, in social housing, and that there are more children growing up poor in a household where somebody works. So creating more good quality jobs and helping families into those jobs is absolutely a crucial part of our child poverty plan.
Black.
And yet we have a situation where families with more children are impacted by the two-child cap and by the benefit cap, and the government is refusing to get rid of these things. At a stroke, they could lift thousands of children out of poverty and improve overnight their life chances. Now, I appreciate the fact that they've got the Child Poverty Task Force, but that's not making a difference to these children today, is it?
I'm under no illusion about the impact 14 years of the Conservatives and the social security system has had on child poverty. And that is why we are determined to take action across government to increase family incomes, to drive down costs, and to crucially put in place the long-term support, particularly in the early years. We'll be producing that strategy by the spring, and I am absolutely sure that every part of that plan will lift more children out of poverty.
Luke Akehurst.
Question number 14, Mr. Speaker.
The last Labour government lifted 600,000 children out of poverty. Under the Conservatives, the number went up by 700,000. There are now more than 4 million children living in poverty in the UK. In the 21st century, in one of the richest countries in the world, I think that is a complete disgrace. And that is why the work of the Child Poverty Task Force that I co-chair with the Education Secretary is so urgent and so important.
Okay, Kirst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost a third of children in the North East live in poverty, and it's a particularly acute problem in the region. Will the Secretary of State work with our North East Mayor, Kim McGuinness, on her excellent regional plans to reduce child poverty?
Yes, we have already met with Kim McGuinness on the 17th of September, where she set out the action she is already taking, and I would say to honourable members on all sides of the House, our strategy will be out in the spring, but we are not waiting to act. Nationally, we've put £421 million into the Household Support Fund to help the poorest families, and mayors like Kim McGuinness are doing amazing work to make sure, working with schools to make sure people claim the benefits they're entitled to, and crucially working with businesses to help them do everything they can to tackle in-work poverty and to make sure those working families get the money to those poor children.
Listen, you.
Question number 15, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer questions 15 and 16 together. The work of unpaid carers is absolutely vital and often heroic, and we're determined to give unpaid carers the support they need. We're looking at the moment at options on tackling the problem with overpayments, including the possible introduction of a text alert service.
Alison Hume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Carers make incredible sacrifices to care for loved ones, but they can be left deep in debt repaying carers' allowance after unintentionally breaching the qualifying rules. Does my honourable friend agree that as a society we have a duty of care to carers? And can he say more about the progress the government is making in overhauling the carers' allowance and addressing the earnings cliff edge?
Grateful to my honourable friend, and she's absolutely right in what she says, and I do agree with her that we need to support carers properly. We want to get to the bottom of what's gone wrong with these overpayments, why so many people have been caught out, and we have been piloting the introduction of a text message service. That's involved texting 3,500 claimants to alert them when HMRC informs DWP that the claimant has breached the current earnings limit. We're looking at those results at the moment, and if they're positive, then that would be the first step to address the overpayments problem. I think there's more we're going to need to do, but that will be a good first step.
Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are nearly 1,200 recipients of carers allowance in my constituency of Shipley. The current earning limit leaves people vulnerable to accidentally accruing overpayments if they become ineligible for carers allowance. It also acts as a disincentive to people working as much as they would like to. Will the government consider raising the earnings limit for carers allowance? Thank you.
Well, my honourable friend has written to me about this matter, and I welcome her commitment to progress in this area. In an excellent piece of work, the former Work and Pensions Select Committee made a number of recommendations on the earnings rules, and once the new committee is in place, we shall be responding to the former committee's proposals.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has indicated the army of carers that we have across the country. We also have an army of unpaid carers who are now being deterred from actually coming forward and applying for carers allowance because of a concern that they will be put into this financial implications. Can the government reassure those people who haven't come forward yet that they will be supported properly?
I very much hope that we can, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member is absolutely right. There is a good deal of anxiety around, I think, about these overpayment problems. We're hoping that this alert service will at least inform people when they run into a problem so that they don't then develop a large overpayment, which has happened far too often in the past. But I think we do need to look as well at the other arrangements around carers allowance to provide the reassurance that he rightly calls for.
Dr. Rupert.
Number 17, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for her question. In May 2019, the universal credit sanction rate was 3.17%, reducing considerably during the pandemic and gradually returning to 3.51% by November 2021. The rate continued to rise, reaching a peak of 7.29% in October 2023, but is now falling with a rate of 6.17% in May 2024.
Recent research by Gingerbread found a high percentage of sanctions misapplied to single parents, not for not meeting the job search requirements, but because of missed meetings due to childcare, like Max, a bereaved single dad of 2, who actually had his overturned, which is quite a challenging process. So in light of all that, would my honourable friend look into overhauling the mess of a system left behind by that lot over there?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and through her, if I may, I'd like to thank Gingerbread for their work on this. There have always been and always will be conditions attached to social security. But the past 14 years show what happens when you have a government that is more interested in blaming people and cheap headlines than offering real help. In our manifesto, Labour committed to reviewing universal credit so that it makes work pay and tackles poverty. And the report that Gingerbread have written will also help inform our Child Poverty Task Force.
We come to Topical's Chris Webb.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm determined to put transparency at the heart of the DWP. So I have today published 31 reports that were sat on by the previous government, something my right honourable friend, the Minister for Social Security and Disability, has long campaigned for. Under this government's leadership, the DWP will be honest about the problems the country faces, focused on the solutions needed to help people build a better life, and that starts with our forthcoming white paper to get Britain working again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first joined WASPy Women in their local campaign activity back in 2017. 7 years later, they're still fighting for justice. Can the Minister ensure women in my constituency and across the country that she'll act urgently, unlike the previous government, and bring this injustice to an end?
I thank my honourable friend for raising that question. I myself met with the WASPy Women campaign before this government was elected. My honourable friend, the Minister for Pensioners, was the first Minister to meet with them in 8 years. It really is a serious report that requires serious consideration. We will do everything possible to get this issue resolved as soon as possible.
Secretary of State Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the 10th of September, 2 days before recess, I led a debate secured by the party that I represent, the Conservative Party, in this chamber on winter fuel allowance. Now, the Right Honourable Lady spoke just now about transparency, but there was no equality impact assessment made available for that debate. Indeed, on the 30th of August, Mr. Speaker, by way of a written question, my honourable friend, the member for Hinckley and Bosworth, established from the government that they had no intention of publishing that particular report. Yet on the 13th of September, 2 days after the debate and the vote, and 1 day after Parliament had risen, the report was made available. It was clearly, in my opinion,
Secretary of State.
agree with me.
Not true. I mean, coming from a party that did not even allow the OBR to do an analysis of Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget, that sat on 31 publications when under its own rules they should have been published, we published an equality analysis. He will know when he was in government this was never done for secondary legislation, but Mr. Speaker, this government will be open and transparent, and that's what we're already doing.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Since the election, numerous constituents have contacted me raising concerns about the Child Maintenance Service's inefficiency in collecting arrears payments. Can the Minister outline the measures being taken to enhance the service's effectiveness in this area?
My honourable friend is entirely right to raise this issue, and he will be pleased to know that this government is looking to utilise new powers to obtain a liability order without recourse to the courts, reducing the time taken to secure such an order from 22 weeks to around 6.
We come to Lib Dem spokesperson Steve Darling.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, may I draw your attention to a report published by the University of Bath very recently, which highlighted how there were a series of cliff edges that benefit claimants faced if they aimed additional funds, and just at £7,399, they would lose the ability for free school meals. What plans do you have to tackle this lack of compassion in the system?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not familiar with the particular report that the honourable member refers to, but we are committed in our manifesto to review universal credit, 15 years nearly after it was first launched. And this issue, the cliff edge issue, and others will be among those that we will want to look at in the course of that review.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 14 years of Tory economic chaos and 17 years of SNP public service failure, as many as 1 in 4 children in my constituency of Cowdenbeath and Kirkcaldy now live in poverty. Last year, the Scottish Children's Commissioner said that former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon had absolutely failed young people in Scotland. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that tackling child poverty will be a crucial part of the work of this Labour government? And as part of the important work she is doing with the task force to develop a new child poverty strategy, will she hold my constituency?
Order. Sorry. The topicals, please, if we can keep them short, because I've got to try and get through the list of others. Who's answering? Secretary of State.
My honourable friend has raised these issues with me before. I will absolutely meet with children, families and child poverty organisations from her constituency. We aim to be visiting every region and every devolved nation as part of that strategy, and I look forward to meeting her and her constituents then.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Data from Marie Curie suggests that 90,000 people die in poverty every year, many of them after a terminal diagnosis. Even with the help of the special rules system, there have been reports of terminally ill people facing mounds of red tape and trying to claim benefits. Is the Minister satisfied the current 12-month limit on special rules is sufficient, and has she assessed how the current administrative burden on terminally ill people claiming benefits can be reduced?
The Honourable Lady raises an extremely important question that I have discussed with a hospice and other organisations like Marie Curie Sue Ryder in my own constituency. I want to look at how the system can be made to work as quickly and swiftly as possible, particularly for people at this very difficult time in life, and I would be happy for the Social Security Minister or my office to contact her directly to get more information.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Research by Sense has found that none of the computers in job centres across Britain are equipped with specialist assistive technology. They have estimated that it will cost £5 million to make sure every job centre has the specialist assistive technology. So will the Minister commit to introducing a job centre assistive technology fund to aid disabled people in their quest to look for work?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member, who's an absolute expert on this kind of inclusive change that we need to make to our employment support system so that we can help everybody. And I look forward to working with her on ideas just like that when we bring forward our white paper in the autumn.
Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the AEAT pension scheme have collectively lost millions of pounds from their pensions, despite being told that they would be no less favourable following privatisation of their pension scheme in 1996. The Public Accounts Committee found that they received inadequate information from government and lost money as a result. Will the Minister provide a clear timescale for redress for AEAT pensioners in this unique case, as promised by a previous Pensions Minister?
I thank him for that question. I have looked into this issue. It has got a long and complex history. I'd be very willing to meet with him to discuss it in more detail.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has today published 31 research papers commissioned but hidden by the previous government, which, amongst other things, provide valuable insight into the experience of disabled people applying for personal independence payments to live and work independently. Why does the Minister think the last government chose not to publish these findings?
My honourable friend asked an extremely good question. The policy of the previous government was to publish all such commissioned research reports within 12 weeks of receiving them. That policy was complied with until 2018, and then ministers stopped complying with it, and we've had to publish all of these reports today. My right honourable friend's announcement is a vital first step in rebuilding trust in the department that was so shattered by the culture of secrecy, obfuscation and cover-up by ministers opposite.
In response to several honourable members, ministers have said how complex the Ombudsman's report into the WASPI women is. Whilst appreciating that, can I ask them for a statement in principle that they will eventually offer significant compensation to the WASPI women?
This is a very complex issue. As I said previously, the Ombudsman took 6 years to consider this complex case. We are looking into this very seriously, but I can't make any announcements today. He will have to wait for our announcement in the round on this issue.
Curtis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's proposed youth guarantee will help ensure young people are learning or earning. Of course, in Wales, the Welsh Government already has the Young Persons Guarantee, which is a key commitment of the Labour-run Welsh Government. Can the Minister assure me and my constituents in Cardiff West that this Government will learn from the work that Wales is doing in this area?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I'd like to assure the member that we will be working with Welsh Government and Welsh local authorities and all of our colleagues right across the United Kingdom to get the policy right for young people. I think they've been failed over recent years, and it's about time they got the future they deserve.
Patel. With employers in the Whittam constituency and across the country about to be whacked with a barrage of higher taxes thanks to this government, how does this government expect employment levels to stay high and for small businesses to be at the heart of any employment strategy that this government claims to have?
I mean, it is under the former government that we had the highest ever taxes for 70 years. And we have job centres where only 1 in 6 employers ever goes to a job centre to recruit. That is why we will transform our job centres into a new jobs and careers service, so people get the help they need and employers can recruit the staff they desperately need too.
Marcus
Campbell-Savers. I welcome the fraud bill proposed by the government. Can the Minister explain how this will claw back money from people who cheat the system, and also how it will protect privacy?
Can I welcome my honourable friend's support for the proposed fraud bill? Current levels of fraud in the welfare system are absolutely unacceptable, with almost £10 billion lost last year. Increased use of data such as this will be essential so that we can clamp down on capital fraud, abroad fraud, but we will do that without sharing any information at all with banks and financial institutions.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her personal commitment to transparency and ask her to share with the House, further to the question from her shadow earlier, how many thousands of people will die as a result of Labour's choice to cut the winter fuel payment?
I am very happy to share the data that shows that there are 200,000 more pensioners living in poverty after 14 years of the government of members opposite, and to publish information on the increase in the number of claims, 152% increase in the claims for pension credit because of the big, bold campaign that members on this side of the House are now running.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents want to see a fair and robust welfare system, but they have no truck with fraud. Can she assure that my constituents that she's doing everything she can to crack down on fraud and to make sure that people that genuinely need help get it? Thank you.
My honourable friend is correct to raise the issue. As I said earlier, we will not tolerate the current levels of fraud in our welfare system. He will be pleased to have noted the announcement made by the Prime Minister recently of a forthcoming fraud, error and debt bill. That will begin the work necessary to drive down fraud in the department.
Final question, Dave Dougal.
Mr. Speaker, can I share with the Secretary of State the plight of my constituent who went without child maintenance payments for 6 months, not because she'd done anything wrong or the paying parent's employer did anything wrong, who processed the direct deduction of earnings order, or that the paying parent wasn't actually paying, but the CMS misplaced the payments. Can she apologise for that mishap? And what plans has she got to rectify this deeply flawed organisation?
I'm very sorry to hear of the case to which the honourable member refers. It is not a case that I am I'm familiar with, but if he would like to contact me with those details, I will look into it for him.
That completes questions. I'll let the front benches clear.
Excuse me, please.
All right. Before I call the Prime Minister, I'm sure the House will wish to reflect for a moment on the fact that this is a solemn day which marks the first anniversary of the terrorist attack on Israel, with dozens of hostages still in captivity. The conflict has claimed thousands of innocent civilian lives. Today is a day when we should come together to remember those, all of those who have been affected. I now call the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we mark a year since the horrific attack on Israel by the terrorists of Hamas. It was the bloodiest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. A day of sorrow, a day of grief. Over 1,000 people were massacred, hundreds taken hostage, in an attack born of hatred, targeted not just at individuals, but at Jewish communities, at their way of life, and at the State of Israel, the symbol of Jewish security to the world. Mr. Speaker, 15 British citizens were brutally slain that day. Another has since died in captivity. Our thoughts today are with the Jewish people around the world, the Jewish community here in the United Kingdom, and all those that we lost a year ago. For so many, the pain and horror of that day is as acute today as it was a year ago. They live it every day. Last week, I met the families of British hostages and those killed on the 7th of October. I sat with them as they told me about their loved ones. I will never forget their words. Mandy Damari spoke of her love for her daughter Emily. She said, and I quote, "My personal clock stopped at 10:24 on the 7th of October, the moment when Emily sent a desperate, unfinished message as Hamas attacked her kibbutz. She is still held captive today." We can hardly imagine what hostages like Emily are going through, nor what the families are going through. The agony, day after day. So I say again, the hostages must be returned immediately and unconditionally. They will always be uppermost in our minds. And I pay tribute again to the families for their incredible dignity and determination. Mr. Speaker, today is also a day of grief for the wider region as we look back on a year of conflict and suffering. The human toll amongst innocent civilians in Gaza is truly devastating. Over 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, tens of thousands orphaned, almost 2 million displaced, facing disease, starvation, desperation, without proper health care or shelter. It is a living nightmare, and it must end. We stand with all innocent victims in Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and beyond. And we stand with all communities here in the United Kingdom against hatred of Jews or Muslims. Because any attack on a minority is an attack on our proud values of tolerance and respect, and we will not stand for it. Mr. Speaker, with the Middle East close to the brink and the very real danger of a regional war, last week the Iranian regime chose to strike Israel. The whole House will join me in utterly condemning this attack. We support Israel's right to defend herself against Iran's aggression, in line with international law. Because let's be very clear, this was not a defensive action by Iran. It was an act of aggression and a major escalation in response to the death of a terrorist leader. It exposes once again Iran's malign role in the region. They helped equip Hamas for the 7th of October attacks. They armed Hezbollah, who launched a year-long barrage of rockets on northern Israel, forcing 60,000 Israelis to flee their homes. And they support the Houthis, who mount direct attacks on Israel and continue to attack international shipping. Mr. Speaker, the whole House, I know, will join me in thanking our brave servicemen and servicewomen who have shown their usual courage in countering this threat. But make no mistake, the region cannot endure another year of this. Civilians on all sides have suffered too much. All sides must now step back from the brink and find the courage of restraint. There is no military solution to these challenges, so we must renew our diplomatic efforts. And together with my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, I've had discussions with the leaders of Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, the G7 and the EU, and made the case at the United Nations for political solutions to end the fighting. In the weeks ahead, we will continue this work, focused on 3 areas. Firstly, Lebanon, where our immediate priority is the safety of British citizens. Our team is on the ground, helping to get people out. We've already brought over 430 people home on chartered flights, and we stand ready with additional evacuation efforts as necessary. And I say again, an important message to British citizens still in Lebanon: you must leave now. Mr. Speaker, we're also working to ease the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon. Last week, we provided £10 million of vital support, in addition to the £5 million we're already providing to UNICEF. But the situation cannot go on. We will continue to lead calls for an immediate ceasefire and the return to a political plan for Lebanon, based on Security Council Resolution 1701, which requires Hezbollah to withdraw north of the Litani River. They must stop firing rockets and end this now, so that people on both sides of the border can return to their homes. Second, Mr. Speaker, we must renew efforts for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. But we cannot simply wait for this to happen. We must do more now to provide relief to the civilian population. And that's why we've restarted aid to UNRWA. We're supporting field hospitals and the delivery of water, healthcare and treatment for malnourished children. But the ongoing restrictions on aid are impossible to justify. Israel must open more crossings and allow life-saving aid to flow. Crucially, they must provide a safe haven for aid workers. Too many have been killed, including 3 British citizens. Israel must act now, so that together with our allies, we can surge humanitarian support ahead of the winter. Third, Mr. Speaker, we must put in place solutions for the long term to break the relentless cycle of violence. The ultimate goal here is well understood. It must be the 2-state solution. There is no other option which offers stability and security. So we need to build a political route towards it, so that Israel is finally safe and secure, alongside the long-promised Palestinian state. This requires support for the Palestinian Authority to step into the vacuum in Gaza. It requires an urgent international effort to support reconstruction, and it requires guarantees for Israel's security. We will work with our allies and partners to that end. But the key to all this remains a ceasefire in Gaza now. The unconditional release of the hostages, the unhindered flow of aid, That is the fundamental first step to change the trajectory of the region. Mr. Speaker, nobody in this House can truly imagine what it feels like to cower under the bodies of your friends, hoping a terrorist won't find you, mere minutes after dancing at a music festival. Nobody in this House can truly imagine seeing your city, your homes, your schools, your hospitals, your businesses obliterated, with your neighbours and family buried underneath. It is beyond our comprehension, and with that should come a humility. It is hard even to understand the full depth of this pain, but what we can do is remember. What we can do is respect and listen to the voices that reach out to us at these moments. And what we can do, Mr. Speaker, is use the power of diplomacy to try and find practical steps that minimise the suffering on the ground and work towards that long-term solution, so that a year of this terrible and bloody conflict can never happen again. That is what we've done on these benches. That is what the whole House has done. And it's what this government will continue to do. I commend this statement to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement? Today is the anniversary of October the 7th. This modern pogrom, the worst loss of life, Jewish life, since the Second World War, was a horrendous reminder of the anti-Semitism in our world and the existential threats that Israel faces. Over the last year, many of the hostages kidnapped by Hamas on the 7th of October have been raped, sexually abused, murdered, and mutilated beyond recognition. And today, a year on, many still remain held by Hamas and other terrorist groups. I think particularly today of the British citizen Emily Damari, who has endured a year in captivity. Across this House, I know that we join in saying, bring them home. The situation in the Middle East is grave. Too many innocent civilian lives have been lost. It is right that this country continues to play its part in defending Israel against Iranian attacks. But we should not forget the base cause of all these events: Iran's refusal to accept Israel's right to exist, and its desire to destabilize the region through arming and funding its terrorist proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The current conflict in Lebanon is a result of Hezbollah's determination to use this territory to launch rocket attacks on Israel. And let me be clear, Israel has a right to defend itself. It has a right to eliminate the leadership of Hezbollah, and it has a right to restore security for its citizens. And this country should support Israel in pursuing these goals. But can the Prime Minister tell the House and expound on what he said about what role the United Kingdom is playing in providing humanitarian support to those Lebanese citizens who have been displaced because of this conflict? And I welcome, I think, his announcements on some financial support to that end. The medium-term question we must help address is what happens once the Israeli operation has finished. And can I ask the Prime Minister to update the House on what steps this country, along with our allies, are taking to help build up the capacity of the Lebanese state so that Hezbollah cannot simply re-establish itself in southern Lebanon? We must never forget that Hezbollah do not represent the interests of Lebanon or its citizens, but those of their paymasters in Tehran. Turning to the situation of British nationals in Lebanon, I know that the government has rightly been urging them to leave for some time now, but it is clear that difficulties in obtaining tickets on commercial flights mean a number of our citizens are still there. I welcome the government's chartering of planes to help British nationals return home, and know very well the logistical challenges involved in this, and pay tribute to all the Foreign Office and other teams that will be working hard to make sure that this happens. And can the Prime Minister assure the House that any British national who wishes to leave Lebanon will be able to do so on a government-chartered flight? And turning next to the Prime Minister's speech at the UN General Assembly, which he mentioned, can
can I fully endorse his reaffirmation that the United Kingdom will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Events in the Middle East and indeed Ukraine are another reminder that the world is increasingly becoming more dangerous. If we wish to be able to continue to deter our enemies, defend our values and stand up for our interests, then we will need to invest more in our military. Now, the Prime Minister and I have discussed previously my view that we should increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. But in our previous exchanges and in this House, he said a trajectory for future defence spending would be set out at the coming fiscal event. And could I just ask that he reconfirm his commitment to that timetable? And finally, on this sad anniversary, can I finish by saying that the United Kingdom stands with Israel against this terrorism today, tomorrow, and always. And to the Jewish community here in Britain, I know that at moments like this, when the Jewish people are under attack in their homeland, Jewish people everywhere can feel less safe. And I know that the Prime Minister will agree with me that across this House, we will always stand against the evils of anti-Semitism.
Prime Minister.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his words, and I do think it's important on an occasion like this that we speak as with one voice across the House, and I think the whole House will agree with him when he says, in relation to the hostages, we must bring them home. They must be uppermost in our minds. He asks about the assistance in Lebanon. Humanitarian assistance is being provided, aid and money. Also training, as he will know, and working towards the Security Council resolution. In relation to the evacuations, he asked about British nationals, and we will make sure that any British national does have the assistance they need to come home. And again, I repeat, now is the time to leave, and if any British national requires that assistance, please make contact with us so that we can provide that assistance. In relation to the 2.5% of defence spending, let me recommit to that we will increase it to 2.5% and we'll set out our plans in due course. But the most important thing today, I think, is for this House to do it as it is doing, which is speak with one voice on the one-year anniversary of an awful terrorist attack. Thank you.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On this anniversary, the House unites in its condemnation of the murder of over 1,000 Israeli citizens and makes a united call for the release of 100 hostages. Parliament also stands behind a belief in the rules-based international order, a belief that all civilian life is equal and must be protected. And so today we mark a year when more than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, 742 people have been killed in the West Bank, and over 2,000 people have been killed in Lebanon. Will the Prime Minister confirm that all British actions in the Middle East will be guided by the principles of de-escalation, peace and diplomacy, and the protection of all civilian life?
I thank her for that question, and particularly her words about all civilian life being equal and protected. And I do confirm that everything we're doing is aimed at de-escalating across the region. It is on the brink, and I think it is important for all sides to pull back from the brink. And that's why we've been working so closely with our allies in the G7 on de-escalation, speaking with one voice. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement? On the anniversary of those horrific attacks in Israel, we remember the victims, the people taken hostage and their families, and we stand with the whole Jewish community. Earlier this year, I visited Israel and Palestine and saw how both peoples were experiencing trauma. We must never forget the trauma of the hostages and their families. In Tel Aviv, I met Itzik Horn, a father still praying for his two sons, Yair and Eitan, to come home. So we must urge all actors to take the steps most likely to get the hostages home quickly and safely. The last year has seen terrible violence in the Middle East, a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and an appalling spike in hate crimes here in the UK. So, we must stand firm against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. We must press for an immediate bilateral ceasefire to end the terrible cycle of violence and bring about lasting peace and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. And we must do all we can to prevent a regional war in the Middle East. UK forces rightly played their part in helping Israel neutralise Iran's outrageous attacks. Now I hope the government will try to convince Israel that keeping her citizens safe and secure is best achieved by restraint, not retaliation, and the risk of a regional war. And as we do, let us take a tougher stance on Iran and all her proxies, from Hezbollah to the Houthis. So will the Prime Minister finally prescribe Iran's revolutionary guard? And finally, Mr. Speaker, we are horrified by the new crisis unfolding in Lebanon. So first, will the government go further on humanitarian aid? And most importantly, can we join the Prime Minister in calling for the cessation of rocket fire, the protection of civilians, and an immediate bilateral ceasefire, just like the one we so desperately need in Gaza?
I thank him for those questions and absolutely agree with him in relation to the hostage families. When I sat with them, often we were sitting in silence because they couldn't find the words to describe what they were going through, and what he says about hate crimes. In relation, and the message and the messaging is very much de-escalation across the region. In relation to the IRGC, we do need to deal with state threats, including the IRGC. He's right about that. We're working at pace to identify further ways to deal with those threats, including those from the IRGC. Already more than 400 sanction designations against Iranian organisations and individuals are in place, and we continue to look at that important issue. Thank you.
Lawrence Session-Lomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the words and remarks from the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in condemning this horrific attack a year ago? Yesterday at church during bidding prayers, we prayed for the conflict around the Middle East and the other conflicts going on. And my thoughts remain with those loved ones who are still displaced a year on. Mr. Speaker, sadly, the United Nations have reported credible evidence of sexual violence against innocent civilians on both sides of this conflict. No matter the intensity of the situation, there can be no justification for sexual violence, which leaves those victims traumatised for many years. So can I ask the Prime Minister what steps the government are taking to raise this issue and to ensure that innocent civilians across the Middle East are protected from the horrors of sexual violence?
Prime Minister.
She raises a very important point about sexual violence, which, as she rightly says, has absolutely no justification, and along with other issues, it's an issue we continue to raise with our allies in relation to any such allegations.
For the House, Sir Edward Lee.
There are many different opinions on policy in the Middle East, but will the Prime Minister agree with me that what unites us, or surely must unite everyone in this House, is our profound detestation of anti-Semitism in all its shapes and forces, and our profound love for the Jewish people on a day of suffering, especially as many of those murdered in the music festival and in the kibbutz were actually actively working for peace? And will he reflect that there are still many people, many Jewish and Arab people, who do want a moderate solution, and we should give them their support?
Prime Minister.
Can I agree wholeheartedly with the remarks in relation to anti-Semitism and a love for and standing with Jewish people, as I say, both across the globe and here in the United Kingdom, many of whom want nothing more than peace and security for themselves and their families, and we will continue to work with them. But I agree with his remarks and the sentiment behind them.
Clive Betts.
Could I agree very much with my right honourable friend's comments about the need for a two-state solution and working towards that on all sides? Does he understand my concern, then, I think wider concern, that the Israeli Prime Minister has repeatedly said in recent weeks that he doesn't support a two-state solution either now or in the future? Does he understand the frustration and anger that creates amongst many Palestinians, particularly young Palestinians, and breeds a climate in where hostilities and violence is likely to increase rather than reduce? What can he do to change the Israeli Prime Minister's mind?
Prime Minister.
We have to be very clear that the two-state solution is the only viable long-term route through this conflict. And recognition has to be a question of when, not if. Israel has a right to be safe and secure, and it's not, and we must have a viable Palestinian state. And however difficult that may seem at the moment, we must never lose sight that that, in the end, is the only political solution to this awful conflict. Thank you.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A year on from when 1,200 Jewish people were systematically murdered, those that were women were raped and mutilated. 254 were taken hostage into Gaza. 101 still remain unaccounted for. I agree with the Prime Minister that we need to make sure that the hostages are returned immediately. But the first aspect of this is to ensure that the International Red Cross have access to all those hostages to assess their state of health and indeed whether they are still alive. Will he press for that to make sure that we know how many are still alive and they can be returned to their families? Those that have sadly been murdered, at least their families will know what has happened to them.
Prime Minister.
Yes, and it's very important. Spending any time with the families, you get a real sense of the agony in what they're going through, which is made even worse by the fact that they don't have any meaningful information about their loved ones. So that is an absolutely essential step to at least reduce some of the agony. I agree with him.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We in my constituency of Walthamstow stand today with our neighbour Sharon in saying the name of her father, Oded Lifshitz, who has been held by Hamas for over a year now, a proud peace activist. We stand with our Palestinian neighbours who were able to escape from Gaza and who now fear for their relatives and what harm may befall them. We stand with our neighbour trying to get out of Lebanon, where he was trying to support local children to learn. We reject the lazy stereotype in this conflict that you have to pick a side. We pick peace. And we simply ask of the Prime Minister to do and show the same. So what reassurance can my honourable friend give me and my constituents in Walthamstow today that everything that the British have in fighting for the rule of law, for diplomacy, and yes, even in our work on arms sales, will be dedicated towards peace and resolution for the innocent civilians in these regions?
Prime Minister.
I thank her for her question. It's a reminder of the impact here in the United Kingdom of the conflict on so many of our communities, and we are absolutely working with our allies on de-escalating across the region. It does require Iran to take responsibility and to be held accountable for what it is doing, and that's why it's important, in my view, for the G7 to speak so powerfully together with a coordinated and collaborative approach.
Leila Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is a devastating day, a sobering day. For those who are suffering the pain of grief, it feels that the claws are being run over those wounds again. We have seen escalation now in the region, something that this House was warning about for months before this point. It is clearer now than ever that the Palestinian question, when the embers finally die down and we can start to rebuild, must be the #1 priority on his and other world leaders' lists, not because it's the right thing to do, but because it is a security concern that we must address if we want a safer world. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to be now showing unprecedented levels of leadership? And may I ask him, what is he doing personally to add to that?
I thank her for her question. She speaks powerfully as ever on this issue. I completely agree that the only way through in the long term is the two-state solution. And in direct answer to her question, we are working non-stop with our allies on that question, answering what happens next, and never losing sight of the fact that the two-state solution is the only way to that long-lasting peace. And we will continue in those efforts. And I know that they have the support of the House. It's so important that we continue to do so, and we will continue to do so. Thank you.
Andy Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister rightly says we need a ceasefire now, but after a year and over 45,000 deaths, what more can he do to achieve that ceasefire? And while the violence in the region continues, will he ask the Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary to look sympathetically at requests from dependents and close relatives of UK citizens for evacuation?
Prime Minister.
On the question of a ceasefire, in answer to his question, we are continuing to work with allies to bring that ceasefire about, to coordinate our efforts. And I recognise that diplomacy is sometimes slow, but it is in the end the only way to bring about that ceasefire. We'll continue to do so. In relation to British citizens in Lebanon, we do have a plan in place. If anybody across the House has any details of our citizens who need further assistance, I would genuinely be pleased if they'd pass them to me so we can action that straight away.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the anniversary of that terrorist attack last year, may I echo the sentiments of the Prime Minister in condemning Hamas support for our Jewish community and, of course, in calling for the release of all the hostages. I also share the Prime Minister's concern about the malign influence of Iran. In that regard, can he confirm to the House that there will be no British involvement, be that personnel, facilities or air bases, in any Israeli response to their abhorrent attack last week?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his question. I'm not, and he will understand, go into details on the floor of the House as to our capabilities, but he will know that the involvement so far, for example, in relation to the attack in April, was in relation to Israel's self-defence when missiles were raining in on Israel, and that is the support that we did provide and would always be prepared to provide.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, as we remember all those killed in the 7th of October Hamas attack and all those killed day after day in Israel's war on Gaza and now Lebanon, the case for peace and the preservation of human life and the protection of human life has never been more urgent and compelling. An immediate ceasefire is desperately needed to stop all the killing, end the war crimes, free the hostages and get the aid into Gaza. But it's clear Israel's right-wing political leaders will keep rejecting ceasefires and keep violating international law without stronger international pressure. So, to get Israeli leaders to back a ceasefire, don't we need to see tougher action, including an end to all arms sales, as recent international court rulings demand?
Prime Minister.
Look, I completely agree that we need an immediate ceasefire, and that is what we're working with. It's what the US in particular is leading on. I don't agree with a complete ban on arms sales. That, Mr. Speaker, would include a ban on arms being used for defensive purposes. Looking at the attack of only a few days ago by Iran, I think the House will understand my position on this and the position of many across the House.
Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has rightly spoken about the significance of diplomacy right now, and I think this entire House would agree that across the region itself, leaders must come together. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what discussions has he had with GCC leaders, the leadership across the GCC, about the behaviour, the aggressive behaviour of their neighbour, Iran, and what role they can play in the de-escalation and preventing Iran from further escalating this terrible conflict?
Prime Minister.
I thank you for that question. This is a really important issue. We have had numerous discussions with our colleagues and with leaders, and I do think there's an important role that can be played and pressure that can be put through those discussions, and we will continue to do so. So I thank her for her question.
Dr Ruperhut.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Among those killed in the horrors of October the 7th were children, with a number still held hostage to this day. And in Gaza since, a grisly new acronym, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family, to add to the child death toll, which is now 2 mounting in Lebanon. Would my right honourable friend press for the protection of children as a priority in his ceasefire advocating and humanitarian efforts? And would he agree that no parent should ever be burying their child?
Prime Minister.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And whether it's children taken as hostages, it hardly seems possible to say that sentence without recoiling, or those orphaned in Gaza, she rightly suggests. Thank you.
Sir Julian Lewis.
I appreciate that it's difficult to get into the mind of a theocratic regime such as the Ayatollahs in Iran, but to what extent has the government been able to establish whether a principal motivation for what happened on October the 7th was the desire of the Iranian regime to prevent a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, its great rival?
Prime Minister.
Look, Iran bears huge responsibility across the region, both in their assistance in relation to the October the 7th attack and through the other action that they are supporting in the region. And that is why we've been very clear in our positioning on Iran and very clear about the responsibility that Iran bears in relation to these awful incidents.
Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the anniversary of the horrific October the 7th attacks, I again repeat the call for the immediate release of all hostages. And in light of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza, the violence in the West Bank and the invasion of Lebanon, I asked the Prime Minister if he believes that Israel's right to self-defence justifies a death toll, according to research by US medical professionals who have worked in Gaza, has now surpassed 118,000, as well as the 2,000 people killed in Lebanon. And will he do what is morally and legally right and end the government's complicity in war crimes by banning all arms sales to Israel, including F-35 fighter jets, not just 30 licences, yes or no?
Minister.
No. But it is a really serious point. Banning all sales would mean none for defensive purposes.
F-35 fighter jets.
None for defensive purposes on the anniversary of October the 7th, and days after a huge attack by Iran into Israel would be the wrong position for this government, and I will not take it.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly pointed out that the conflict in the Middle East has been manipulated and sponsored by the Iranian regime, and we should stand by Israel, who is bearing the burden, taking the risks and standing up to world opinion in taking on Iran and its proxy terrorist groups. But can he tell us what part can our government play in putting pressure on the Iranian regime, and why is it that the Revolutionary Guards, who are sponsoring much of this terrorism, can still operate freely in London?
Prime Minister.
Can I agree with him? We must stand by Israel and be absolutely clear about Israel's right to defend herself, particularly at this time of escalation by Iran. I think in relation to his question about the Iranian regime, we have to be really clear that we stand with Israel. We have to be really clear in condemning Iran, and we have to do that with our allies with one voice, so that the message is heard very, very powerfully. Thank you.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, I associate myself with the condemnation of the atrocities committed by Hamas a year ago. But that said, there is a growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and the restriction on aid is unacceptable. So what more can the international community do to achieve the free movement of aid into Gaza?
Prime Minister.
addressed this in my statement. We need to get more humanitarian aid in. It's desperately needed. It's been needed for a very, very long time. And that is why we continue to press for that aid to go in, and of course for the protection to go in for those that will then be delivering it once the aid gets in to Gaza that is desperately needed.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the barbaric attack on October the 7th, we've seen an explosion in anti-Semitism and extremism on our streets of our own country. Only on Saturday, we saw people flagrantly valorising Hezbollah in London. We have to root out those who despise our country and our values. What will the Prime Minister do to revoke visas, where appropriate, of those in the UK who are conducting themselves in this manner, to encourage the police to enforce our existing laws without fear or favour, and to further ban and prescribe those organisations such as the IRGC, which do not support the UK, our values, and the way we wish to conduct ourselves in the world?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question, and we are proud of the democratic right to protest in this country, but supporting a prescribed terrorist group is unacceptable, and we need to be very, very clear about that and give the police our full support in taking the action that they need to take in relation to it, wherever it is in the United Kingdom.
Manjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we mark the anniversary of the horrific Hamas attacks, the subsequent colossal death and destruction, and the ensuing escalation in the region, for anybody in any doubt in the country, Iran is no friend of ours, and indeed is disliked by many of its neighbouring Arab nations for its destabilising activities in the region. And it was abundantly clear to many of us that as soon as Iran came to the aid of its proxy Hezbollah, that Israel's allies would come to its aid to protect it from Iranian missiles. However, it is also extremely frustrating that Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to ignore the international community, the UN Security Council resolutions. Indeed, our own UK Prime Minister, who was one of the first to call for an immediate ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. And indeed, this UK Parliament, which voted 8 months ago for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So, Prime Minister, how exactly is the UK government going to help bring all sides to the negotiating table and secure peace?
Prime Minister.
Well, his comments about Iran are absolutely right, and we must stand with Israel in the face of the attacks wherever they come from and wherever they are sponsored. And in direct answer to his question, we are working with our allies on de-escalation. We are working with the US in particular on their plan for a ceasefire, because it is only through a ceasefire that we can create the space for the hostages to be safely released, for the aid to get into the region, and a foot in the door for the political solution, a two-state solution, which is the only way to lasting peace.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister spoke quite rightly of the fact that we can barely imagine the pain of both the Israeli families and those in Gaza affected over the past year since that Hamas atrocity. But it's also a pain that's felt acutely in our own communities, by our Jewish communities and our Muslim communities. So can the Prime Minister tell us, since we've had 5,000, a record number of anti-Semitic attacks in this country since that atrocity, what he's going to do to reassure the Jewish and Muslim communities and work with the CST and Tel Mama to strengthen their bonds?
Prime Minister.
She raises a really important point, and we have upped the support to both communities as a result of the dreadful rise in hate crime in all its manifestations in the last year or so, and we will continue to do so, and I know we'll have the support of the House in doing so.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's a day of mourning for all those who lost family members on October the 7th and in hostage in tunnels since, for all those civilians in Gaza, the West Bank and now in Lebanon. Like the Prime Minister, I've been meeting hostage families all this last year. The only time they got released was when there was a hostage prisoner deal on the 22nd November last year, where 150 prisoners were released and 50 hostages released. Has the Prime Minister spoken to the Israeli government about another deal to allow the hostages to be released through swapping with political prisoners held in Israeli jails?
Prime Minister.
I accept his point that it's through a cessation of hostilities that the space can be created for the release of hostages. And yes, of course, we talk to leaders, including in Israel, the whole time about how that can be brought about, because it is the central focus of all of our discussions with Israel and with our allies.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's vitally important that on today and every day we remember every single life lost at the hands of Hamas a year ago, every single life who was lost in captivity since, and renew our calls for the release of every single hostage. And whilst I totally agree with the Prime Minister when he says that Israel must have that right to defend herself, some of the decisions he has taken has led to a feeling that this government has stepped back its support for Israel, not least in the restoration of the funding of UNRWA. Does the Prime Minister regret that, and will he revisit that decision so that actions marry up with words?
Prime Minister.
No, there's been no stepping back of support for Israel. We've been absolutely robust in that support, and I've expressed it many, many times in different places, including to the Prime Minister of Israel, and we will continue to support Israel. We'll continue to support Israel's right to defend herself. I think this House is at its best when it speaks with one voice.
Mohammed Yazid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a year of profound suffering, darkness and trauma. Tens of thousands of innocent people have been killed and displaced. Yet the world has learned nothing. The prospect of two-state solution is a distant dream, and the odds of all-out war in the Middle East is growing by the day. The unimaginable devastation has to stop. The only hope is a diplomatic solution. So can the Prime Minister show me today that the government is doing everything in its power to bring about an immediate and permanent ceasefire across the region?
Yes, and we're not doing it alone. We're working with our allies in relation to it. I spoke to G7 allies last week about it. We speak constantly to the US about it because we need to de-escalate across the region. We've seen escalation in recent days and weeks, and all sides need to pull back from the brink.
Ali Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Green Party, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks made by the Prime Minister and others in this House today in remembrance of all those who lost their lives and were taken hostage in the horrific terrorist acts on October 7th last year. One of those was Haim Katzman, murdered by Hamas in Kibbutz Holit, and whose brother Noy has had his words included in a collection of speeches and eulogies published today by Standing Together. Noy says this of Haim: "I have no doubt that, even in the face of Hamas's people that murdered him, in the face of their extreme right-wing beliefs, he would still call out against killing and violence of innocent people. Here, too, he would be empathetic to pain and oppression." These are powerful words, and in this spirit, I'd like to express my continued and deep concern at the disproportionate response of Israel to the attacks on October the 7th, and the extent to which that has perpetuated pain, oppression, and the killing of innocent people. In recent days, this response has resulted in an escalation of deadly violence. I welcome the Prime Minister's words today about commitment to de-escalation. Does he agree that an urgent ceasefire, both between Israel and Hezbollah and between Israel in Gaza, is essential to resolve the conflict?
Well, she read out some very powerful words, which I think will have been heard across the House. And yes, de-escalation is absolutely needed at the moment as the region stands on the brink.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I associate myself with your own words and those of the Prime Minister in opening his statement today. In any time of conflict, our focus must be on two things: de-escalation and peace, and on the plight of the civilian population, whether they be those hostages kidnapped on the 7th of October, whether they be those in Lebanon now sheltering in the street, or whether they be those in Gaza who seek to find health facilities to treat their loved ones and themselves when they suffer from attacks by Israel. What more can we do to support the health service in Lebanon, which is now
on its knees and which really does need our support if it is to help the people of Lebanon.
We do need to help and assist with the health services in Lebanon, and along with the other humanitarian support that we're putting in, along with the support we're putting in relation to training and other matters. It's so important that we do so, and we are in constant contact with the Lebanese authorities in relation to that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of us have been fortunate enough to see the very good work that UNRWA has done on the ground over many years. But to be effective, an aid delivery vehicle does need to be rigorously impartial. Given that, will the government treat with UNRWA with caution and carefully, and remember that other aid delivery agencies are available?
Prime Minister.
Look, of course we have to be careful and make sure that any agency absolutely complies with law, international law, and where there are any allegations, they're properly investigated and any wrongdoing is rooted out. We do have to provide, or help to provide, aid across the region, but it is caveated by the first part of my statement in relation to the point that he rightly raises.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to put on record my sorrow at the appallingly violent events of the 7th of October 1 year ago in southern Israel, and for all the days of violence we've witnessed since. Mr. Speaker, since the House last met, the forced displacement of almost 2 million residents of Gaza by Israel's military action has been compounded by a further 500,000 forcibly displaced in Lebanon, again by Israeli military action. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he share the concerns of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, that the Israeli invasion in destroying civilian infrastructure, killing civilians and impacting humanitarian operations is a breach of international law, and what further steps will he take to enforce a ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm not going to accept invitations to agree with other people's assessments. I'll make my own. I've been absolutely clear that Israel has the right to defend herself in accordance with international law. The displacement is a very serious issue across the region. Very many people have been displaced. Many of them simply want to go home. That includes Israelis as well, who've been displaced from their homes. And that is why we need to de-escalate, to ensure that those displaced can return back and live safety in their own communities.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In just 15 months, Iran will be free of many of its restrictions in its production of centrifuges and uranium enrichment under the JCPOA. Given the new nexus of evil of North Korea, Iran, and Russia on nuclear technology transfer, does the Prime Minister believe the JCPOA is still fit for purpose?
Prime Minister.
He raises a really important point in relation to the nuclear ambitions that we absolutely have to be alive to and make sure that Iran cannot possibly get weapons, and the sanctions and the regime around that has to be geared towards that central issue.
Debbie Abrahams.
My heartfelt sympathies to the families who lost loved ones in the terror attack a year ago today, as well as those who have loved ones that are held in captivity at the moment. And I would also like to do the same for ordinary Palestinian civilians who have lost loved ones in the violence of the last year. It's quite clear that in today's heightened tension across the region, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Lebanon is not possible. So will the Prime Minister share with us, he's talked about a roadmap, will he share with us what the steps are towards this peace process and the immediate ceasefire that is desperately needed in the region?
I accept that an immediate ceasefire is difficult. I do not accept that it's impossible. And the US and Qatar are working hard on this and have our full support in the action that they are taking, because the reason the US are leading on this is because they well understand the importance of a ceasefire to create the space for all of the other relief that needs to be provided, and of course for the hostages to be released.
Daisy Cooper.
This House knows that when events unfold abroad, they often reverberate on our streets here at home. Despite the trauma of the last 12 months, I'm incredibly proud that in St Albans, the rabbis, our imams and other religious leaders have worked hand in glove to make a bold statement called 5 Principles for Dialogue: Why Jews and Muslims Refuse to Hate Each Other. And they've taken that statement into our primary schools, into our secondary schools and into community forums as well. It's had a very profound effect in my community. Can I ask the Prime Minister, is the relevant government department actively seeking out examples of initiatives like this in order to build, or when necessary rebuild, interfaith dialogue and community cohesion right across the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Yes, because I think it's really important, that joint work and some of the interfaith work that was done before October the 7th didn't have the resilience that many of us thought and hoped it would have. Rebuilding it is hard, but should be supported wherever it takes place. And I was interested to hear the particular example that she referred to.
Up to Sam Mohammed.
I thank the Prime Minister for his comments. My thoughts and prayers are with all of those affected by the violence and war over the past year. Human rights and international law apply equally and without favour. All lives matter, Palestinian, Israeli and Lebanese. When breaches of international law are committed, then they should be condemned equally. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that a ceasefire in Gaza is the best way to de-escalate violence? And will he give assurances that this government will do all it can to support diplomatic measures, keep an open review on arms sales? And does he agree that we must at all costs avoid getting involved in a Middle Eastern war which could have catastrophic consequences both here and abroad?
Prime Minister.
We are working constantly with our allies to de-escalate the situation, to hold those responsible to account, and to ensure that we bring about the much sought-after peace that all communities want.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as the terrible loss of life of Israeli, Palestinian and Lebanese citizens, a shocking number of journalists have been killed or wounded while covering events in the Middle East. Will he pay tribute to the courage of journalists who are risking their lives daily simply to do their job? And will he re-emphasise the importance of protecting and respecting all media workers who are covering conflict?
Prime Minister.
Yes and yes. It's a very important point. Journalists, those working in the media, are risking their lives in order to ensure that the rest of us have information about what's going on the ground. Too many have lost their lives, and we must respect that and pay tribute to the really important work that they do. And I am grateful to him for raising a really important issue.
John MacDonald.
Today is a day of sombre remembrance of the suffering on all sides. But if the threat of a war against Iran takes place, we will need to revisit that discussion within this chamber. But I'm pleased that the Prime Minister has rightfully demonstrated that our concern about the suffering on all sides, and particularly mentioned the suffering of children. When the Ukraine war as the Ukraine war took place, we set up the scheme for the evacuation of children who were seriously injured in Ukraine to come here for treatment. In January, I raised the prospect of that scheme being introduced for Palestinian children and others. Raised it again in May. Wrote to my honourable friend and the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary in July. I wrote again in August and I wrote again in September. There doesn't seem to be any progress on developing such a scheme, despite the willingness of clinicians here. Could the Prime Minister look at that and how we can achieve progress?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for that, and he's right to emphasise the impact this has on children in particular, and we do have special responsibilities in relation to children in any conflict. The first step to protecting children is to create the conditions for a ceasefire, is to de-escalate, which is why, working with our allies, we are spending so much time on that de-escalation and finding a route through to a ceasefire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In February this year, I stood in the wreckage of some of the kibbutzim where the atrocities took place on the 7th of October, and I was struck then by the families who we met and their desire for peace rather than revenge. And since then, I'm afraid to say that I've heard minister after minister stand at the dispatch box and mouth the words of peace and de-escalation, and yet the situation has got worse and worse and worse. So my question to the Prime Minister is this: how many more people will have to die before we realise that talking is not enough and that we have to take action with our partners to compel a ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
I think what happens at the dispatch box is the reporting back of the action that we're taking elsewhere. That's under this government and under the last government. And when not at the dispatch box, we are working with our allies to bring about the ceasefire. I accept it's difficult. I accept it has not yet happened. I refuse to give up on the idea that through diplomacy we can reach that de-escalation and ceasefire, and we will continue to work with our allies to do so. I think what we've tried to do, particularly in recent weeks, is to coordinate with our allies so that we speak and take action in one coordinated way, which for me is more powerful than each nation taking action separately.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the words of honourable and right honourable members today and add my thoughts to the families and hostages that were taken a year ago, and I too hope for their safe return. Mr. Speaker, latest figures suggest that there are approximately 6,000 Lebanese nationals in the UK with a temporary right to remain. Lebanese nationals in Edinburgh have recounted to me their fears about returning home and their concerns about the inevitable humanitarian crisis that will follow should the conflict continue. Can I ask my right honourable friend if the government will commit to looking at options to ensure no Lebanese national currently in the UK is forced to return to Lebanon during this current conflict?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I can give that assurance, and it's very important. We need to get British nationals who are in Lebanon out of Lebanon as quickly and as safely as possible, and we certainly shouldn't be returning people back to the conflict zone whilst the conflict is going on.
Ben Lake.
Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary delivered important statements at the UN last month, emphasising the importance of upholding both the principles and the purposes of the UN Charter as a foundation for rules-based international order. The PM rightly states today that a political settlement is the only route to a lasting peace and stability in the region. In working towards that aim, what consideration is his government giving to official recognition of Palestinian statehood?
Prime Minister.
The question of recognition is a question of when, not if. Well, at the point of greatest impact, we do need a two-state solution. We need to work with our allies towards that end, and we will continue to do so because this conflict will not de-escalate until there's a political route through.
Afsana Begum.
It is with profound sadness that we take stock of the past year, in which 1,200 Israelis were killed by Hamas's horrific attack, and over 41,000 Palestinians and thousands in Lebanon that have been killed by the Israeli military onslaught. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that all lives should be cherished, Israeli, Palestinian and Lebanese, and that nothing can ever justify the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and will he join me in calling for a ceasefire and accountability in the region of the Middle East?
Prime Minister.
I certainly agree that all lives should be cherished, and I think that is the position across the House. As I've said, de-escalation and a ceasefire is the only way forward, which is why we're working so hard on it.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I welcome the Prime Minister's call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, there is so much more he can do to bring that about. As South Africa's Foreign Minister said, the decision to stop the fighting in Gaza is in the hands of those who supply Israel with weapons. And he knows that international law does not differentiate between offensive weapons and defensive weapons. So why does he continue to licence 90% of weapon sales to Israel when there is ample proof that UK weapons are still being used to prolong this catastrophe?
Prime Minister.
For the reason I've twice stated, if sale of weapons for defensive use by Israel were banned, that is a position that I could not countenance a year after October the 7th. It's not a position I could countenance in the face of attacks by Iran. The whole House saw the number of missiles coming over into Israel only the other day. And the idea that we could say we support Israel's right to defend herself and at the same time deprive her of the means to do so is so wholly inconsistent that it will never be my position.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scale of the devastation that we have seen in the Middle East is appalling, including in recent weeks 127 innocent children killed in Lebanon. The scale of death is appalling and the potential for further escalation is terrifying. Can the Prime Minister tell the House how he is working with his fellow world leaders to push for de-escalation and a peaceful settlement?
Prime Minister.
Yes, we are working with our colleagues and our allies constantly, whether that's through the G7, whether that's on bilaterally, a numerous daily contact on this to bring about the de-escalation that is so desperately needed.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hezbollah began its latest assault on Israel on 8th of October, the day after Hamas's attacks on Israel. The Iran-backed terror group has fired over 12,000 rockets towards Israel over the past year, yet the international community only called for a ceasefire after Israel responded. Now, the Prime Minister said he's committed to standing by Israel against the threats it faces, but will he deliver on his commitment to prescribe Iran's IRGC?
Prime Minister.
Well, in relation to the IRGC, I gave an answer earlier on in relation to that. We do need to address state threats, and we're looking at how we can do that, and we'll continue to do so.
Linda Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said, the horrific Hamas attacks 1 year ago inflicted unbearable pain and loss on Israeli civilians, and we continue to condemn these attacks in the strongest terms. I remember clearly too the fear that my then colleagues in Gaza, Palestinian aid workers, felt as bombs began dropping on them that night. The healthcare system in Gaza is now all but destroyed, and according to the UN, there have been 36 recent attacks on healthcare facilities in Lebanon. Israeli forces are also now using fighter jets to bomb refugee camps in the West Bank. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is unacceptable? And as he will be aware, the UK Government is the UN Security Council lead on the protection of civilians. Next month, when the UK has the UN Security Council presidency, will he ensure a focus on the protection of civilians?
Prime Minister.
Well, she speaks with great experience, and yes, we need aid into the region, and we need to protect aid workers, because that is the only way that the aid can get where it is needed.
Lee Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today we mark that terrible anniversary of the biggest slaughter of Jews since the Second World War. And we must also note that since that day, over 60,000 Israelis have been displaced in northern Israel by the actions of Hezbollah. Therefore, the Israeli government had no choice but to mobilise the IDF, and any Israeli citizen has to do that. Yesterday in Leeds, I'm very proud that the city had a multi-faith remembrance service in Millennium Square, over 1,000 people. And does the Prime Minister agree that that's in marked contrast to the individual who drove out into hiding the Jewish chaplain of Leeds because he had to serve as a member of the IDF because an Israeli citizen? Is that not a pure act of hatred and anti-Semitism?
Prime Minister.
We must hunt that hatred out wherever we see it, and he's quite right to raise it and to call it out. We must also focus on the multi-faith work, and he referenced that, and I think across the House we want to see more of it. And he's absolutely right about the displacement in northern Israel. Many families simply wanting to return to their homes, both sides of the border, but we must never forget the impact it has on them.
Nigel Kelliscan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement at what is a sombering day as we reflect
on the past year, the atrocities of the 7th of October, and of course the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and now in Lebanon. In my constituency of Barking, I have communities that have links to Israel, to Gaza, to Palestine and also to Lebanon. And they regularly raise with me the need for an immediate ceasefire. Does the Prime Minister recognise that ceasefire is a critical step in what in the end can be the only solution, which is a political solution for the region?
Yes, and that's why we're working with allies, including the US, on seeking to bring it about.
Richard Owen.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. 1,200 butchered, 250 plus hostages taken, over 100 of whom are still there, including Emily Damari, a 28-year-old British citizen. Can the Prime Minister recommit today to do whatever it takes to leave no stone unturned in ensuring that she is returned to her family and that, if necessary, British assets are used to help extract her?
Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely, and that is the commitment I gave to her mother and the other families that I met last week and then on various other occasions before that. I've sat with her mother and seen firsthand the utter agony that she is going through, as any parent would in those circumstances, and I gave her that commitment. I repeat it here.
Alex Burrell-Curtis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and associate myself with the clear calls for unimpeded access to aid, immediate ceasefire and an immediate return of the hostages. But since this heinous terrorist attack 1 year ago, we have seen here at home a consequential increase in the crimes of hate, anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. I know his commitment to tackling the scourge of such hatred. I've seen it up close. So will he assure me that his government will continue to challenge all such forms of hatred, both here and abroad?
Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely. We can and we must. And I think across the House, we all know the impact of hate crime. We've all been horrified by the increase over the last 12 months, and we have a duty and a responsibility to do everything we can to reduce it, and we will work with others to do so.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I also join the Prime Minister in offering my condolences to the families of all those killed and continue to be killed. I also join the Prime Minister in relation to release of hostages, and all hostages, including those children that are held in the Israeli detention centres without charge and without any legal representation. Given what the Prime Minister said in relation to self-defence, when it's in itself is a moot point, is this Prime Minister stating to this House that all offensive weapons are banned and it's just defensive weapons that are being supplied?
He will well know the legal framework that we have, the domestic legislation in place that was passed and applied by successive governments and our international obligations. We've taken our decisions against that legislation in accordance with that legislation, as the House would expect. And we have published a summary of our reasons for doing so for the House to examine.
Johnny Ward.
You don't know.
Condolences to all those affected by the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. And can I also thank the Prime Minister for his statement today. Can I ask the Prime Minister if he agrees with me that the sharp rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen since the 7th of October, actually now reaching the highest ever recorded in the UK, is a stain on our democracy? And can I ask him to pass his reassurances to the Jewish communities across the UK that his government's doing everything it can to ensure their security and safety and to tackle this scourge of anti-Semitism?
Let me give that reassurance. I think we are all shocked by the sharp rise in anti-Semitism. We need to work with all communities to bring that down in relation to hate crime, whichever community it is aimed at, whether it's the Jewish community, Muslim community or any other community.
Joy Morris.
May I thank the Prime Minister for clarifying the government's position on Israel's right to defend itself.
And will the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary clarify to this House what steps are being taken to tackle violent disorder and anti-Semitism in London? Many people in many British Jewish communities here in London feel under threat. Particularly this weekend, we saw violent protests. What is the government going to do to tackle that and to make our British Jewish communities feel safe again?
We have to support the right to freedom of protest, but at the same time be absolutely clear in relation to terrorist organisations and support for terrorist organisations that is not to be tolerated. And we will work with the police and other law enforcement to ensure that we tackle it and stand very, very firm on it.
Just silence.
Matthew. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, as with so many times in the history of the Jewish people, we are bound in grief and in mourning. Would the Prime Minister assure the Jewish community that we are not alone in that grief? And would he take this opportunity to join me in praising the dignity, the courage and the love shown by the families and friends of the hostages in their efforts to bring them home?
Let me give that assurance that they're not alone, and let me pay tribute again to the families. It is incredibly moving to spend any time with them and to hear firsthand what they are going through. And as I've said to them every time I've met them, the impact it has, I think on anybody listening to it, the impact it has on me is profound.
Iqbal Mohammed Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I join the Prime Minister and the House in offering my condolences to the families of all those Israeli civilians killed on October the 7th, and all innocent civilians, Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese or other, over the last 12 months. Over the last 12 months, over 950 Palestinian bloodlines have been wiped off the face of the earth. No family member remains from those generations. Over 1,000 families have only one sole survivor remaining, living today. What message does the Prime Minister have for the British Palestinians and the surviving Palestinians in the affected region, and what is he doing to protect them from the same fate as the 42,000 and counting?
There's been far too much bloodshed and killing, far too many children orphaned, and I give my assurance that we will do everything we can, and we are doing everything we can, to de-escalate, to bring about the ceasefire, to allow much-needed aid to go in, hostages to come out. But I absolutely understand the strength of the point that he puts to me.
Andrew George.
The Prime Minister says that I stand with Israel, I stand with peace, I stand with the Israeli people, and I stand with the Palestinians and the Lebanese equally. But this isn't mere semantics. I applaud that the military from the UK were involved in protecting Israelis at the weekend. But where is the equivalence for the people of Gaza and of Beirut and elsewhere?
In the work that we're doing to bring about de-escalation and a ceasefire, because that is the only route through. That is why we're working with our allies so closely on those issues, and will continue to do so.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tragedy of the deaths a year ago have now been compounded by tens of thousands more deaths in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Lebanon. Gaza is now reduced to a place of rubble and famine and thirst and premature death, and lots of children looking for their families. The bombs that have rained down on Gaza and other places are in part supplied by this country. The International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have both made very strong opinions on the whole situation there. Will the Prime Minister revisit the whole situation of the sale of British arms that are being used to bomb Gaza and kill wholly innocent Palestinian civilians?
We've set out our position that domestic law is clear, international law is clear, and we've taken our decision and put a summary of that before the House.
Jim Allister.
Mr. Speaker, if those of us in this House at this distance can feel the pain of the dastardly attack of a year ago, we can but imagine the indelible imprint on the people of Israel and Jewish folk across the world. Can I ask the Prime Minister, has he a view on the fact that our national broadcaster, the BBC, refuses to call those who perfected this heinous terrorist attack, refuses to call them terrorists, and likewise now with Hezbollah? What is the government's position on that, and what representations have they made?
The government's position is that Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist organisations. We stand very firm on that and rightly call them what they are.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to join the Prime Minister in condemning the Iranian ballistic missile attack last Tuesday, and I am supportive of the role that UK armed forces had in defeating that attack on Israel. Back in January, the Prime Minister said that parliamentary approval of military action is only needed when deploying troops. We don't know how Israel will respond to the Iranian attack, and the government could find that they are asked to contribute at short notice. Can the Prime Minister set out what he meant when he said that a parliamentary debate and vote would be taken only when deploying troops?
The whole House condemns the attack by Iran of a few days ago. We all saw the impact of that, and I think the whole House will understand that there will be occasions when it's important for a government to act without coming to this House first.
Tim Farrell.
Mr. Speaker, I too had the sobering experience that others have had of meeting some of the hostage families recently. One of those families, a member of one of those families, his brother had seen his wife, the mother of their new baby, murdered before his eyes just before he was taken by Hamas. And yet, the hostage families that I met showed a desire for peace and reconciliation, which I found utterly breathtaking and humbling, and it gives me hope. So does the Prime Minister agree that the release then of the hostages is not just the right thing in of itself? Of course it is, but it is also a major key to ending this conflict, because any ceasefire without the hostages release is de facto not a ceasefire.
Well, I do agree with that, and that's why I say the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages is what we must continue to press for. I too have been struck by the incredible resilience of the families. It's humbling to listen to them and comprehend what they're going through, but nonetheless their insistence that there has to be a peaceful way forward for all concerned.
Jim Chin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank very much the Prime Minister for his statement today and for his strong statement, which we in this House support, and well done, thank you. In light of recent events, it's become clear that Israel's right to defend itself is supported verbally, but effectively condemned when Israel does take action. So would the Prime Minister, ever mindful of the 1,200 Israeli citizens so brutally murdered 1 year ago, today condemn the disgraceful anti-Semitic demonstrations that took place in the streets of London yesterday, and ensure that all military aid is made available for Israel against the murderous intentions of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis and Iran? Thank you.
Let me condemn the anti-Semitism wherever it is, whenever it is. We must stamp it out and stand together across this House in doing so. Thank you.
That completes the statement. We will now let the front benches clear. Before we come to the next statement, could I say to the government that I understand and the whole House understands that the business of the government goes on during the recess and that ministers will always need to respond to events in the UK and around the world. However, it is frustrating for honourable members on both sides of the House where major planned announcements are scheduled during periods when the House is not sitting, particularly towards the end of recess. Whilst I appreciate the government informing me directly on developments on some of these issues, that does not substitute informing the House. If announcements made towards the end of last week had been held over the weekend, then honourable members would have had the first opportunity to question the Secretary of State on it, rather than learning about it through the media. Ministers should come to the House to announce their policies in the first instance, if that means waiting a few days. And the excuse that we may have an election elsewhere in the world is not my concern, because it is the elected members in this House on both sides that I represent. Secretary of State David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for your instructions at the beginning of this statement, and with permission I will make a statement on the conclusion of negotiations on the exercise of sovereignty over the British Indian Ocean Territory. On Thursday, the 3rd of October...
Order. I've done the bidding. I don't need others to come in on the back of it. Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. On Thursday, the 3rd of October, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister and Mauritian Prime Minister Juggernaut, made a historic announcement. After 2 years of negotiations and decades of disagreement, the United Kingdom and Mauritius have reached a political agreement on the future of the British Indian Ocean Territory. Mr. Speaker, the treaty is neither signed nor ratified, but I wanted to update the House on the conclusion of formal negotiations at the earliest opportunity. Members will appreciate the context. Since its creation, the territory and the joint UK-US military base on Diego Garcia has had a contested existence. In recent years, the threat has risen significantly. Coming into office, the status quo was clearly not sustainable. A binding judgment against the UK seemed inevitable, and it was just a matter of time before our only choices would have been abandoning the base altogether or breaking international law. Mr. Speaker.
Order. You'll all be able to question the Secretary of State, so please just wait for that moment. You've been here long enough to know they don't come at this stage. Good try, but not working. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, if you oppose the deal, which of these alternatives do you prefer? Doing this deal on our terms was the sole way to maintain the full and effective operations of the base into the future. Mr. Speaker, this is why in November 2022, the then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Braintree, initiated sovereignty negotiations. It's also why, Mr. Speaker, my predecessor, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, ultimately continued with those deals. Mr. Speaker, under the previous government, there were 11 rounds of negotiations. The last one held just weeks before the general election was called.
Exactly.
So in July, this government inherited unfinished business where the threat was real and inaction was not a strategy. Inaction posed several acute risks to the United Kingdom. First, it threatened the UK-US base, from countering malign Iranian activity in the Middle East to ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's critical for our national security. Without surety of tenure, no base can operate effectively nor truly deter our enemies. Critical investment decisions already being delayed. Second, it impacted on our relationship with the United States, who neither wanted nor welcomed the legal uncertainty and strongly encouraged us to strike a deal. Mr. Speaker, I am a transatlanticist. We had to protect this important relationship. And third, it undermined our international standing. We're showing that what we mean is what we say on international law and our desire for partnerships with the Global South. This strengthens our arguments when it comes to issues like Ukraine or the South China Sea. And Mr. Speaker, further legal wrangling served nobody's interests but our adversaries. In a more volatile world, a deal benefited us all, the UK, the United States and Mauritius. This government therefore made striking the best possible deal a priority. We appointed Jonathan Powell as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for these negotiations, and he's worked closely with a brilliant team of civil servants and lawyers. Their goal was a way forward which serves UK national interests, respects the interests of our partners and upholds the international rule of law. This agreement fulfills these objectives. It is strongly supported by partners, with President Biden going so far as to applaud our achievement within minutes of the announcement. Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin have also backed this successful outcome, which reaffirms our special defence relationship. And the agreement has been welcomed by the Indian government and commended by the United Nations General Secretary General. In return for agreeing to Mauritian sovereignty over the entire islands, including Diego Garcia, the UK-US base has an uncontested long-term future. Base operations will remain under full UK control well into the next century. Mauritius will authorise us to exercise their sovereign rights and authorities to respect Diego Garcia. This is initially for 99 years, but the UK has the right to extend this. And we have full Mauritian backing for robust security arrangements, including preventing foreign armed forces from accessing or establishing themselves on the outer islands. The base long-term future is therefore more secure under this agreement than without it. If this were not the case, I doubt the White House, State Department or Pentagon would have praised the deal so effusively. This agreement will be underpinned by a financial settlement that's acceptable to both sides. Members will be aware the government does not normally reveal payments for our military base overseas, and so it would be inappropriate to publicise further details of these arrangements at this stage. Mr. Speaker, the agreement also recognises the rights and wrongs of the past. The whole House would agree that the manner in which Chagosians were forcibly removed in the 1960s was deeply wrong and regrettable. Mauritius is now free to implement a resettlement programme to islands other than Diego Garcia. The United Kingdom and Mauritius have also committed to support Chagosians' welfare, establishing a new trust fund capitalised by the UK and providing additional government support to Chagosians in the UK. And the UK will maintain the pathway for Chagosians to obtain British citizenship. Furthermore, Mauritius and the UK will now establish a new programme of visits to the archipelago for the Chagosians. This agreement also ushers in a new area of our relations with Mauritius, a Commonwealth nation and Africa's leading democracy. We have agreed to intensify cooperation on our shared priorities, including security, growth and the environment. The agreement ensures continued protection of these islands' unique environment, home to over 200 species of coral and over 800 species of fish. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to reassure the House and all members of the UK family worldwide that this agreement does not signal any change in policy to Britain's other overseas territories. British sovereignty on the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar and the sovereign base areas is not up for negotiation. The situations are not comparable. This Mr. Speaker, has been acknowledged across our overseas territories. Fabian Picardo, Chief Minister for Gibraltar, vocally supported this agreement, stating that there is no possible read across to Gibraltar on the issue of sovereignty. And similarly, the Governor of the Falklands has confirmed that the historic context of the Chagos Islands and Falklands are very different indeed. The Government remains firmly committed to modern partnerships with our overseas territories based on mutual consent. After Mauritius' elections, the Government will move towards treaty signature, and it is then our intention to pursue ratification in 2025 by submitting the treaty and the bill to this House for scrutiny. This is a historic moment, a victory for diplomacy. We've saved the base. We've secured Britain's national interests for the long term. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am grateful to the Foreign Secretary for sharing his statement with me in advance. Mr. Speaker, when the world is more dangerous than at any point in our lifetimes, when the Middle East is now on the edge of serious conflict, when there is war in Europe, and when British military forces are engaged in protecting an ally from Iranian missiles, the Government proposes to give away a key strategic military asset to a state which has never controlled it and to which the Chagosian people feel little affinity, if any. It is frankly, Mr. Speaker, astonishing that this announcement was slipped out at the end of last week, a few days before Parliament returned in order to advantage the election timetable of the governing party in Mauritius, rather than by making a statement here in this House. The Times newspaper put it well, and I quote, that in a dangerous world, British security is being risked by ministers and departmental lawyers who believe appeasing faux anti-colonial sentiment in the UN matters more than national interest. Mr. Speaker, UK sovereignty has applied to the British Indian Ocean Territory for more than 200 years. Its strategic location, right in the centre of the Indian Ocean, is unmatchable, and it houses our one and only military base in the Indo-Pacific. I can tell the House, Mr. Speaker, that this is a deal that the former Foreign Secretary, my noble friend Lord Cameron, would never have done. And nor, for that matter, would my right honourable friend, the member for Braintree. Had they been willing to do so, then the deal, Mr. Speaker, would have been concluded long ago. The Conservative government declined to enter into a deal with Mauritius for reasons that I think are now clear for the House to see. Nor has the Labour government published a draft treaty, only a non-legally binding joint statement. So we are somewhat in the dark about exactly what has been agreed. And crucially, can the Foreign Secretary guarantee that there will be a vote on this treaty? Mr. Speaker, is it not the case that the noble Lord West of Spithead, the most senior military figure ever to hold office in a Labour government, said as follows: "There is an irrefutable case that ceding the Chagos Islands to Mauritius would be an irresponsible act which will put our strategic interests in danger, while also recklessly undermining fundamental principles of international law." So I would be most grateful if the Foreign Secretary could answer the following 5 questions. First, never mind what the First Minister said. First, what steps has he and the government taken to reassure the people of Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands that this ill-advised decision will have no effect on their sovereignty? Second, and of yet greater importance, what steps is he taking to make clear that this decision will have no read-across for the sovereign-based areas in Cyprus, Episcopi, Dekelia and Akrotiri? Third, what assurances has he received that no Chinese military assets will be placed on any of the nearby islands in the archipelago? While his words are welcome, the House needs to see the wording clearly set out. Fourth, precisely how much money in total are we now planning that British taxpayers should pay to Mauritius, and for each year under this deal, as well as in total. We want full transparency on all payments that the government intends to make and what the money is for. What are the payments for the privilege of giving it away? Fifth, what consultations has he undertaken with the Chagosian community in this country and elsewhere? We note that his honourable friend, the Member of Parliament for Crawley, with courage and integrity, has opposed this deal. It remains to be seen whether others on the benches opposite will have the good sense, courage and integrity so to do. And in view of the fact that Jonathan Powell has only just been appointed as the special envoy for these negotiations, can he assure the House that the government has actually given the time to draw upon his expertise? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are proposing to give away Britain's key strategic assets in the Indian Ocean. Little or no attention has been paid to the position of those with direct heritage and family links to Chagos themselves. We have no clear details of any safeguards to be put in place against China, a close ally of Mauritius, setting up military facilities and surveillance capacity not far away. Mr. Speaker, by this statement today, the government gives succour to our enemies in a dangerous world and undermines the strategic web of Britain's defence interests. Mr. Speaker, our country is the poorer and the less for it.
Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've got to say it takes some brass neck to criticise this government for delivering what they tried and failed to do. It was quite literally the last government that opened these negotiations in the first place because they understood what was at risk. And they went through 11 rounds of negotiations and resolved nothing. Instead, as with much as we found across government, they left it for us to inherit and to fix. He praised the former Foreign Secretary and the member for Braintree, now auditioning for the Tory leadership, who seems to have suffered short memory loss in the last few years. He told the Commons that in negotiations with Mauritius, and I quote, "Our primary objective is to ensure the continued effective operation of our defence facility on Diego Garcia." That is exactly what we delivered. Don't take my word for it. Ask President Biden. Ask Secretary Blinken. Ask Secretary Austin. If this could win the approval from the White House and the Pentagon for protecting security interests, then I think the right honourable member can rest easy and put down some of the bombast. The reality is that if you don't support this agreement, you either support abandoning the base or breaking international law. So I ask him, which is it? Our agreement secures the base. It stops a potentially dangerous illegal migration route. It protects the marine areas. It provides new support for the Chagosians, and it ensures that the UK is compliant with international law. There was a time when the Tories believed in international law. Now they seem to have given up, telling other people basically they should go ahead and break it. The honourable gentleman knows that this was a serious negotiation begun by the last government, left to us to conclude. It secures the future of a very important security asset in the Indian Ocean. They posture, we lead. And of course, Parliament will get the scrutiny that it deserves in the coming months. He knows too that this was a negotiation between two governments, and of course we kept the Chagosians informed all along the way.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and in a parallel reality, may I ask the Foreign Secretary a question about a particular aspect of this treaty which I don't believe is going to get a great deal of attention in all the heat and fury, but it's very important. At a time when our oceans have never been under such stress, the British Indian Ocean Territory is one of the last ocean wildernesses in the world, with tuna trawlers lining up on the boundary of the no-take zone, trying to entice fish across into their nets. Yep. Artisanal fishing of the Chagosians who have come home is quite possible within this ecosystem, but not licensing fishing. And any break in environmental protection will lead to a huge spike in illegal fishing. Could the Foreign Secretary inform the House what provision has been made to ensure the ongoing protection of this unique part of the world once the administration of the islands is handed over to Mauritius, and what involvement the Chagosians have had in this process?
Very good. Very grateful to my right honourable friend, and I want to reassure her that we, of course, will do everything we can and have done everything we can, which includes combating illegal fishing to better secure the environment. And as part of the deal, there is absolutely the establishment and the management of a new marine protected area, and we will work and continue to work with the Mauritians on that marine protected area, and of course the United States will play its part as well. I'm very grateful for the question.
Lib Dem spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Liberal Democrats welcome the effort to comply, 5 years on from the ICJ ruling, with the advice of the Court, while protecting our national security interests at a time of global insecurity. But we want to put on record our concerns about the way in which this process was conducted, and the risk that it bakes into a new treaty the historic injustices faced by the Chagosian people. The voice of the Chagosians has been excluded throughout the negotiations and the outcome. This is deeply regrettable. The UK rightly believes in the principle of self-determination, and yet there has been no opportunity for the self-determination of Chagosians. I met today with Maxwell Evernor, a Chagosian living in Crawley who is desperate to return to the islands. Maxwell said to me, "All we have is our voice, but that has been silenced for so long." Can the Foreign Secretary set out the ways in which the voices of Chagosians can be injected into the process, even at this late stage? This House was too often bypassed under the former Conservative government, and so I welcome the Foreign Secretary's assurance that there will be proper parliamentary oversight of the final treaty. Finally, may I also express my concern at some of the language used by those on the benches of the official opposition in response to this announcement. There is no equivalence between the Chagos Islands and other British overseas territories. We must be absolutely clear about that, and I hope the Foreign Secretary will affirm this. For some Conservative members to entertain the idea that Gibraltar or the Falkland Islands are in some sense at risk is to play into the hands of those who do not share Britain's interests. We in this House must speak with one voice when it comes to Britain's sovereign overseas territories.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrat for raising the plight of the Chagosians. The way in which the Chagosians were treated in the 1960s was wrong and is a matter of immense regret, and he's absolutely right to raise those issues. He will know too that this was a negotiation between two state parties, as is the way in relation to this, and we sought to keep the Chagosians informed along the way. And it's my belief that the last government also sought to do that. And I want to reassure him that a trust fund has been set up to ensure that Chagosians are able to get that support. Chagosians are also able to apply to this country for citizenship. And whilst there is not one view amongst the Chagosian groups, because he'll recognise that there are Chagosians in the Seychelles, there are Chagosians in Mauritius, and there are Chagosians in the United Kingdom. Hard to get one view. We will continue to do all we can to support them. Very grateful.
Tan Desi.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I acknowledge the Foreign Secretary's words of trying to right an historic wrong
and how this will help to improve relations with the Global South. And I also note the words of support from our closest ally, the US President. However, what mechanisms have been put in place to ensure that the strategic defence importance of the US-UK base remains after the expiration of this deal? And also, how will we ensure that the voice of the Chagosians, who have never been under Mauritian government control, how will that be central in any future arrangement?
Very grateful to the chair of the Defence Committee, and let me just say that in relation to the Global South, that he too will have seen that the government of India welcomed the agreement, and India committed to remaining to working with Mauritius and like-minded partners, including the United Kingdom. This was important. I should also say to him that the agreement that has been struck can be extended upon completion of the lease. And as I said before, we are committed to working with the Chagosians, and that is why we have a trust fund set up. And of course, now that Mauritius, effectively on completion of the treaty, will be in charge, they are saying that they will work with the Chagosians on resettlements on islands, not Diego Garcia, but some of the other islands in Surrounds.
Andrew Rossendale.
Deputy Speaker, this is a shameful day for British democracy. This is a dark moment for human rights in the United Kingdom. Already the people of the Chagos Islands have been forcibly removed from their homeland. Today, this government is handing their home over to a foreign country in cahoots with a hostile nation. The Foreign Secretary must commit to allowing the Chagosians, the British Chagosian people, the right of self-determination, just as we afford to every other British overseas territory. Are the people of Chagos Islands less worth than the Falkland Islanders or the Gibraltarians or any other British overseas territory? Will he commit to allow the people of the Chagos Islands to decide their own destiny?
I think the honourable gentleman knows better than this, having chaired the all-party group on Mauritius. He knows that these discussions began under the last government. He also knows, and will have read the ICJ judgment, he knows that it's important that this deal was struck. The last government left it to us to do, and we did it, and we're proud of it.
Sean Davies.
Deputy Speaker, the words that are said in this House really do bear a huge amount of weight, particularly for those citizens in Gibraltar and in the Falkland Islands. Can the Foreign Secretary very clearly set out there's nothing in this agreement or in this statement today that affects their settled status and their self-determination?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that question, and of course I agree with him wholeheartedly.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman that even when I was over there, I was opposed to what my government was doing, even they were only going to go halfway. The truth is, he supported that then. Why has he turned around? And the one point I want to make to him and other colleagues sitting on the bench, the Mauritian government is guilty of vast human rights abuses, locking up other politicians who were independent, and also the Black Creole Mauritians were literally traduced by that government. We've handed to them, therefore, the rights over what the Chagosians have never agreed to. So my question to him is really, why was this a rush just before their election? They will use this now to benefit themselves in the re-election process. Why do we do that? To support a disgusting government in league with the Chinese?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, who has immense experience in this House, and this House knows that sometimes across the floor one's able to strike up friendships and we're fellow Spurs supporters, but let me say to him that this is a country that is part of our Commonwealth. And so I can't possibly associate myself with the remarks that he just made. This was an important... let us be clear that I think it is a matter of regret what was done to the Chagosians back in the 1960s. That has been a sore that has run through our relations with Mauritius, but also with substantial parts of the global south, and that is why we have struck this agreement and continued negotiations. I remind him, 11 rounds. He may well have disagreed with the last government, but 11 rounds that they undertook.
Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the penultimate day of the last Labour government, David Miliband, then the Foreign Secretary, created the Marine Protected Area around the British Indian Overseas Territories. It was then the largest area anywhere in the world that had been protected. And my honourable friend knows, my right honourable friend knows, that the last time a prosecution was made for illegal fishing in that area was in 2020, 4.5 years ago. And the way in which it was conducted meant that £10,000 fine was levied against the vessel, a mere slap on the wrist. These vessels take hundreds of thousands of pounds of fish out of that marine protected area. Who is going to pay, and how much is the government committed to ensuring that that marine protected area continues to exist? Who will pay it, and how will they ensure that the minimal level of protection that currently is in place is increased?
Well, I know how my right honourable friend has championed these issues for many, many years. Can I reassure him that this was an issue of intense discussion under the last government and this government? We recognise the importance of that marine protected area, and of course, when he sees the provisions of the treaty come forward, we can have a further discussion on that surety.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, it would appear that the potential judgment, next judgment of a spurious, rather political foreign court matters more than the issue of national sovereignty. And you boast that President Biden likes this deal. Now, the Speaker earlier on said that this House should not be affected by elections that take place in foreign countries. But I wonder, how confident are you, if the 47th President of the USA becomes Donald Trump, that he will approve of this deal, given the importance of our relationship with America?
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. Let me reassure him that we have sought to take views across the US political establishment. But I do say to him, to get a US president, a US Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Defence, applaud this agreement, should reassure him that the US would do nothing that would help our enemies, particularly the Chinese, in this regard.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Minister confirm that despite others trying to score cheap political points and recklessly scaremonger those residents in our other overseas territories, confirm that this government is completely committed to supporting the right of self-determination of the people of Gibraltar and the Falklands? Thank you.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend who chairs the all-party group, I think, on Gibraltar. We unequivocally support the right of both the Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands to self-determination. And I was very pleased to see the Chief Minister come out categorically and put down some of the false statements that were being made last week.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The old principle that we used to apply was the Wilson principle, the principle of self-determination, that the Foreign Secretary may remember is the defence of the Falkland Islands, the defence of Gibraltar. He's now just violated that principle by undermining the rights of the Chagosian people in favour of a claim that was abandoned in 1965, never really made, because it was only administrative and never properly governed from Mauritius anyway, and in favour of a court whose judgment was advisory. He sold out the sovereignty of the British people. Truly, nobody apart from a boy called Jack has ever made a worse deal on the way to market. He's come back with a handful of beans that he's trying to sell as a prize.
I've got to say, I have always admired the honourable gentleman's eloquence, but I haven't always admired his principles. He was part of the last government. Did he raise this when he was part of the last government? Did he make it a resignation issue? No, he didn't, because he knows we inherited this and we had to make a deal.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by congratulating the party opposite for their sudden interest in national security? And they must have forgotten all about the millions and millions of Russian rubles swilling about their bank accounts. But I do have a question for the Foreign Secretary, if I may. And I want to ask a question on behalf of my constituents in Plymouth, but also the constituency of the Royal Marines community in the UK. And the Falklands and Gibraltar represent something really personal and special to anyone who served in the Navy or the Royal Marines. These are places which hold a real emotional weight. Not only does it say Gibraltar across the Royal Marines cap badge, but it's written across our hearts. Can the Foreign Secretary please assure that constituency of what this government's plans are as regards the Falklands Islands and Gibraltar? Thank you.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue, for his service and the seriousness with which he puts his remarks. And I can give him that unequivocal assurance for the Falklands, for Gibraltar, for Cyprus, and the rights that exist. This situation, which in the British Indian territories is completely different, not comparable. And I regret that in a way this has been made against the backdrop of a Conservative leadership contest, and colleagues who know a lot better have sought to make partisan points with something so important.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Did the government take the trouble to consult the head of its own strategic defence review, Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, before announcing this decision? And if so, what did Lord Robertson say? The SDR is supposed to report early next year. Would it not have been more sensible to see what its findings were before taking a militarily risky decision like this?
Can I say that this is a deal that secures the future of the base beyond the lifetime of anyone currently in this Parliament, and can be extended. That is why it's been welcomed by the Secretary of Defence in the United States, and I would have thought that a former head of NATO, of course, welcomes this deal because it secures the base and our national security and the national security of the global community.
Gregor Poynton.
Deputy Speaker, thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that the vital operations on the base on Diego Garcia will remain completely unaltered and without disruption thanks to this agreement?
Very grateful to my honourable friend. Absolutely, yes I can.
Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 210 years, Chagosians have been traded, they've been deprived of their liberty, they've been deprived of their dignity, they've been displaced from their homeland, and now, thanks to this process, they face the prospect of being dispossessed from both their islands and from their future hope of self-determination. Chagosians are not children. They do not require and they do not ask for a trust fund. They're a proud community of many thousands of people who have been wronged time after time and who are looking today to the Foreign Secretary, to the UK and to the members of this House to ensure that their right to self-determination is understood and respected. Many of those Chagossians are outside right now. Can you offer them that reassurance and think again on this negotiation?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that the way that the Chagossians were treated was wrong, and this deal secures a right for settlement for them to the outer islands. He will know that there are a range of opinions amongst them, but he's absolutely right to put on record the manner in which they were treated, with this whole House, I would hope, would accept as a matter of immense regret.
Elaine Stewart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, does the Minister agree that the threat of illegal migration onto Diego Garcia carried the threat of creating a further smuggling route into the UK? Has that threat now been shut down?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising a very serious issue. On the signing of that treaty, this now is a matter for Mauritius, so she's absolutely right to highlight that very important issue in terms of our own national security.
Edward Lee.
I don't know how many people actually have visited these islands in this chamber. Well, I went there with the Defence Select Committee 38 years ago. And it was crucial in our whole effort in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And we never appeased once in that Cold War, and we won it. The question I want to ask, and it's a serious question, is given that Mauritius has a close relationship with China, given that we can't trust a single word the Chinese say with our experience on Hong Kong, given that they are militarizing islands all over the Pacific, are we absolutely sure that sometime in the future the Chinese will not exert pressure on the Mauritian government to have a base on these islands?
I've got to say, for such a senior member of the House of Commons, that I've got to tell the honourable gentleman that he should just check his facts a little bit more closely. Mauritius is one of only 2 countries in Africa that has not participated in China's Belt and Road. Mauritius is an ally of India, not China.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This government has committed to a reset of the UK's relationship with the Global South. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that putting this issue to bed will help neutralise the charge that the UK plays by double standards where international law is concerned?
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise this issue. Some will argue that the ICJ advisory opinion of 2019 was only advisory, and the UN General Assembly resolution of the 24th of May 2019 was not binding. But he will recognise that many of our closest allies voted against us on that occasion, and it is important that we are a country that upholds the rule of law. I am called to come to this dispatch box to make the case for standing with Ukraine and to make the case for international humanitarian law. And for all of those reasons, we must be a country that upholds the rules-based order.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We've just handed sovereign British territory to a small island nation which is an ally of China. Yes. And we are paying for the privilege. Yep. Also that the Foreign Secretary can feel good about himself at his next North London dinner party. In whose interests does he think he serves? Those of the global diplomatic elite or those of the British people and our national interest?
Well, I hope that question may have garnered him a few more votes, but if that's his position, he's unlikely to lead the Conservative Party to victory. This deal secures the base. It is in our national interests. That is why it is a good deal, and I've got to say, that is why the President of the United States, the Defence Secretary in the United States, applaud and welcome this deal. What do they know about global national security that he doesn't.
Tim Rocker.
Deputy Speaker, it is fairly unseemly seeing a leadership race being conducted in the middle of a foreign policy debate, because that is what is happening. But does the Secretary of State agree with me that the clarity over the legal status of Diego Garcia, achieved through diplomacy with a Commonwealth partner, actually cements our influence in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I'm hugely, hugely grateful, because the Commonwealth matters to this side of the House. It used to matter to that side of the House. And as we head to Chagos in Samoa, it's hugely important that we are a country that plays by the rules. That's why this agreement is so important.
Brendan O'Hara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't think it will come as a huge surprise to anyone that, unlike the outraged masses on my right, I have absolutely no problem whatsoever with the principle of the United Kingdom divesting itself of what little remains of its colonial past. But can I ask the Minister about the involvement of the Chagosian people in this process, a people who he accepts have been treated shamefully by the United Kingdom and whose forced displacement is rightly regarded as a crime against humanity? Let him be absolutely clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. When did his government meet with the Chagosian people? What were the nature of the discussions that were had? And to what extent was the opinion of the Chagosian people represented in this deal?
Well, look, as I've said, this deal will mean that for the first time, Chagosians are able to resettle on the outer islands. As I've said already, this was a negotiation between the United Kingdom government and Mauritius. That was the nature of state agreement. And of course, we've sought to keep Chagosians informed. But I do remind him, and he knows this, there are a range of Chagosian groups, some in the Seychelles, some in Mauritius, some in this country.
Laura Kirksmith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The former Conservative Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Braintree, when he was leading negotiations with Mauritius, said, "Our primary objective is to ensure the continued effective operation of our defence facility on Diego Garcia." This government has now delivered that. On that basis, shouldn't the Conservatives be welcoming this agreement?
Well, my honourable friend is completely right. But she knows that they've got a leadership contest on. This is a bit of a beauty parade, and it's why they're stepping away from a negotiation that they begun, had 11 rounds on, and failed to deliver.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mark. Having heard the Foreign Secretary's performance this afternoon, we now know why they didn't dare announce this in the House of Commons. This abject surrender of British sovereign territory for nothing, for that's what it is, now risks a Chinese veto over an absolutely vital military facility. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary, how much in rent will this country now pay Mauritius for the right to lease back what's already ours, and which government department, the MOD or the FCDO, will pay the landlord?
The honourable gentleman mentions the Chinese veto. The Chinese do not have a veto in this House. The treaty will be scrutinised by this House. All members will be able to look at it. All members will be able to debate it and reflect on it. And of course, at the time of publishing the treaty, there will be a discussion of the costs. But I say to him, no basing agreements ever discuss costs, because that would damage our own national security, and this government's not prepared to do that.
Gordon McKee.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Given the previous government began these negotiations, does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that while members opposite may be more interested now in the views of Tory party members, that this government will always act in Britain's national interest?
And honourable friend is right. It used to be that the party opposite claimed to be a party of defence. This is an agreement that secures our national interests, defence and security interests, in an important part of the globe. It's shameful, frankly, to see them behaving as they are this afternoon.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I just describe the Right Honourable Gentleman as hopelessly naive? Has he not seen how the rule of law, the rule of international law across the world is collapsing under the challenge from Russia, Iran, North Korea and China? And given a few flimsy pieces of paper, how much does he think that China or any of those other countries will respect it after we have given up the principle that this is British sovereign territory?
I've got to say, up against a tough geopolitical environment in which Russia, Iran, North Korea and China are far from playing by the global rules, it's hugely important that this country is a country that supports the rules-based order, and it's hugely important that this facility has been secured for longer than anybody else in this Parliament is able. That is what we've secured, and I have to say, I trust the judgment of our closest ally, not the honourable gentleman.
Kevin Bonavia.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the fact that an agreement has been reached over the Chagos Islands, which helps right a historic wrong and guarantees the security we need. Amongst the confected outrage from the benches opposite, we have heard the expected scaremongering over the future of other territories, including Gibraltar. I note that both the Foreign Secretary and the Minister for Europe have in recent months reaffirmed the double lock on Gibraltar sovereignty, meaning that not only will Gibraltarian sovereignty never be altered without its people's consent, but also that the UK government will never enter into the process of negotiation with which the Gibraltarian people are not content. Does this remain the case?
Well, he's absolutely correct, and my honourable friend, the Minister for Europe, communicated that with a letter to the Prime Minister just a few weeks ago. What we have seen in the last few days from the opposition has been wholly irresponsible.
And Karen Bradley.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has said that he's establishing a trust fund and that Chagosians will be able to apply for British citizenship. What discussions did he have with the Chagosian people about that, and can he confirm that the Home Office is ready to deal with those applications?
Can I say they already can apply for UK citizenship, and of course we have been in dialogue and discussions with the Chagosian. My honourable friend, the Minister for Overseas Territory, has met with them regularly.
Paul Brickell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this agreement has no bearing on the government's relationship with the other overseas territories, and that the UK government's policy towards the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar and other territories remains unchanged, with support for their right to self-determination?
Self-determination is the key word, and we absolutely support the right of the people of the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar in that regard.
Sammy Wilson.
Coming from Northern Ireland, I'm not surprised that this government has surrendered British interests against the wishes of the people who live there, because after all they supported the deal which the previous government did in relation to EU demands on Northern Ireland. But the government has given away a strategic interest. It has not published the deal, it won't reveal the cost, it won't guarantee that Chinese influence in this strategic area will not be guaranteed, and also, of course, it's handed to a country which has no historic claim Does he not recognise the impact that this has on other people who are eyeing British territory? The EU and Gibraltar, the Argentina and Falklands. But this is a dirty, dangerous and desperate deal. It's a shameful surrender of British interests. Is he relying on the fact that the government's got a huge sledgehammer majority which can drive this through this House despite the impact that it has on long-term British interests?
I think the honourable gentleman lost much of the House when he said that people live there. They don't live there. That's the whole point. They don't live there. This is a deal that will give them the right to resettlement on the outer islands. I don't recognise the caricature that the honourable gentleman has made this afternoon.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. President Biden has welcomed the agreement. Secretary Blinken has welcomed the agreement, as has Secretary Austin. Does the Minister agree with me that Tory critics opposite do not know more about US national security than the White House and the Pentagon?
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, he makes an important point, because he knows, as this whole House knows, that it doesn't matter who is in the White House or who is in number 10. For generations, the US and the UK have acted in consort, and the future of Diego Garcia has been central to that, central to the security of the Indo-Pacific and the wider Indo-Pacific, but central also to global security. And the capabilities across our nations are essential and important. And that's why it's so sad to see the Conservative Party falling, frankly, quite, not living up, frankly, to where they should be on these crucial issues of national security, which ought not to be partisan.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Speaker, my old boss, Admiral Lord West of Spithead, won his Distinguished Service Cross in 1982 in the Falklands, and the right honourable gentleman will know he's a former Labour Security Minister. Why then does he think that Lord West is of the view that what the right honourable gentleman is doing poses a grave security risk to this country, and further is likely to undermine our position in the Falkland Islands? And will he give a straight answer to my right honourable friend, the member for New Forest East, in asking whether another noble lord, Lord Robertson, has been consulted in any way over the decision that the Foreign Secretary has made?
Yes. I would urge him to read the remarks of the Chief Minister of the Falkland Islands, and I would urge him to consult more widely the defence establishment in this country, who are pleased that an issue that was looking that would become very contentious between us and the United States in terms of global national security has now been settled.
Lord Arthur.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and in particular the reassurances given to our brothers and sisters in Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands. I think the scaremongering around those two areas has been absolutely shameful, absolutely shameful. But in the spirit of trying to achieve cross-party consensus, I think it's really important. To acknowledge the work of the previous government on this subject and how that has provided the foundation for what we have today. Before then, progress was all too slow, and it did shame our country. Nonetheless, I want to give the Secretary of State opportunity again to reassure us that this deal is in our strategic interest and also the interest of our partners.
Well, there's seriousness, of course, behind the honourable gentleman's question, and I want to reassure him that alongside my colleague, the Defence Secretary, we have sought to secure a deal that secures the future of the base long after any of us are left in this chamber, that ensures that China particularly could not locate on any of the outer islands, as well, of course, as Diego Garcia. And I think that is why, in truth, the President, the Defence Secretary and the Secretary of State in the United States have welcomed this deal. But I also think it's important to recognise that India has welcomed this deal. They do not want China in their backyard.
Sir Desmond Swain.
How does the cost of leasing compare with the savings that the government is making on winter fuel allowance?
The honourable gentleman will be able to return to these issues when the treaty is before this House, and he must wait, as I do, for the budget of the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Dame Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder if the Foreign Secretary would have a go actually answering a direct question. How much will the UK have to pay for the privilege of ceding our sovereignty?
Well, as I've said, these will be issues that can discuss when we have the treaty. When we have the treaty, it is not routine for any government to comment on basing arrangements. She would not expect us to do that and put our national interests at stake.
Oliver Ryan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I wonder whether the Foreign Secretary agrees with me that this government's commitment to our populated British overseas territories is fundamental, unshakable and unbreakable. I'm glad to hear him make the statement that he's made today, and I think this is a good thing for Britain.
My honourable friend is right. There is an important distinction between the Indian Overseas Territories and Diego Garcia and, of course, Gibraltar and the Falklands, and that is, of course, that they are populated. The self-determination of those people is central to their future, and that's why the remarks that have been made over the last few days are wholly unacceptable and shameful.
Corbyn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, will the Foreign Secretary take this opportunity to recognise that what happened to the Chagosian people in the 1960s and 1970s was abominable, abusive, illegal and disgraceful, and many of them lived in poverty for many years after that in the Seychelles and in Mauritius. And they've long demanded their right to return to Diego Garcia and to the archipelago. That has been denied until now. And I think it should be right for the Home Secretary to pay tribute to those Chagosians that led that campaign for the right of return and the right of resettlement on their home islands. And an apology is due to the Chagosian people for the way they were treated. But could I also ask him about the situation facing Diego Garcia? It's unclear to me whether or not Chagosian people can visit, can reside, can stay there, can remain there, or are they going to be denied going there for another 140 years because of this deal that's been done with the USA? And finally, ask him this: why has the Americans been offered a 140-year lease as part of this deal? That is a very long time in recorded history of any sort. In fact, it's longer than most places have many countries have even existed. Can he explain that?
Well, I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman has been championing the plight of the Chagosians for many, many years in this House, and he makes his remarks with tremendous passion and strength, and he's right to do that. The way that they were treated was wrong, and in bringing forward the treaty in the months ahead, I will have more to say on that very matter. In relation to whether they will now have a right to visit Diego Garcia, I've got to tell him that they will not have such a right under this treaty. Any resettlement or visits will be to the outer islands. This is an important US-UK security base, and so I'm afraid I'm not able to give him that assurance. They do not have that right under this treaty.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't believe I ever had the pleasure of flying into our joint base on Diego Garcia, either in the US Air Force or as a pilot in our own Royal Air Force, but its strategic value in terms of its capabilities that it offers and its relationship that it cements with our US partners is clear, as was its contested existence.
Does my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, agree with me that it was a Tory government that started these negotiations because they recognised the dangerous situation facing the base, and that it was this Labour government has now ensured the base is undisputed and has a secure footing?
Well, I'm grateful to my dear friend. And let me just say thank you for your service. And you're absolutely right to raise the issue of these islands being contested and this agreement now putting them beyond contestation. And that makes us all more secure as a result. And I think he knows because of his service. And I think that most of the general public knows, those that have paid attention to this, recognise that this is a deal that we in the United Kingdom can be proud of.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say to the Foreign Secretary that after that performance, I'm delighted to read that there will be a reshuffle at Christmas. Yeah. The Foreign Secretary should revisit his statement where he said that my noble friend Lord Cameron carried on these negotiations. I was his parliamentary private secretary when he ended these negotiations. Yep. This Foreign Secretary capitulated in 3 weeks. Can I therefore ask him, in the sham negotiation that he's carried out, that no military equipment will be allowed to be stationed not only on the outer islands but on the inner islands under this agreement over the 99 years? And can I ask him to outline to this House, because he's not managed to outline much to this House this afternoon, what scrutiny structures and how many votes we will be allowed in this House when he lays that treaty? Yeah.
Yes to his question, and we will come forward with plans in due course.
Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the Foreign Secretary's oral statement, he said a binding judgment against the UK seemed inevitable. That seems to me to be misleading verbal baby food at best. And at a time when, particularly as so far there's been a non-binding advisory opinion, there's been absolutely nothing which suggests we're going to breach any form of international law. But at a time when we have got increasing global conflict, I would like the Foreign Secretary to explain to the House why is there such urgency to do what he is proposing to do now. It seems to me it's going to be a case of acting in haste and repenting at leisure.
Can I say to the gentleman, it was precisely to put the base on a secure footing because of that global uncertainty that this deal was the right deal to do.
Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have to say I am surprised by Labour's conversion to the merits of leasehold rather than the security of freehold ownership. I didn't think that was their position. But in addition, Madam Deputy Speaker, to being an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the British Indian Ocean Territory is host to unique capabilities for space observation. It's the only remote monitoring space in the southern hemisphere able to see parts of the sky to which we would otherwise be blind. At a moment when space is a heavily contested military domain, did the Foreign Secretary even know about these space monitoring capabilities? And what are his plans to secure alternatives to save our freedom and security?
Foreign Secretaries don't comment on such capabilities, but the House would have heard his remarks.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given there is no dispute, I don't think, amongst the House that Diego Garcia is a vital, strategic, important base in the heart of the British Indian Ocean Territory, will the Foreign Secretary today undertake, when he publishes the details of the treaty provisions, to do two things? One, what will be the exclusion zone around Diego Garcia, how many miles? And two, what provisions will be in the treaty to prevent any other foreign power establishing a sovereign military base in any of the archipelagos of the British Indian Ocean territories?
He's right to raise these issues, and there will be provisions that he can scrutinise in that regard in the coming months.
Jerome Mayhew.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has come to this House today with the smile of a favourite, having exchanged British sovereign territory for a 99-year lease from a Chinese ally, and he expects to be applauded for it. He claims in his statement that we can extend this lease. Can he inform the House whether that right is unilateral, and if so, by how many years will that extension be? And why does he think that this piece of paper is going to prevent Chinese encroachment?
Well, as I've already said, they are not a Chinese ally. They're one of two countries that's not participated in China's Belt and Road in the continent of Africa for a reason. They're an ally of India. They are not a Chinese ally. And I have to say, it's hard to take the honourable gentleman seriously if he can't even get his facts right.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard of great interest of all these other countries the Foreign Secretary is looking to please. I'm interested about our country. I'm interested in what goes on in this House. Will the Foreign Secretary confirm that we will have a vote, and by what mechanism will that vote come to this House so we can have a say on our sovereignty and what we own? Absolutely.
The honourable gentleman is not new to this House. We will follow the usual process as he'd expect.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We saw a previous Labour government sell off this country's gold. We now have a Labour government that is surrendering our sovereignty and giving away our territory. On the specific point of the Chagosians, I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary if and when he's had any specific discussions with the Chagosian people as part of these negotiations.
I've got to say, I am not going to take lectures from a party that left us a 22 billion black hole. A 22 billion black hole. They left us, and they left our public services in a state. The chutzpah of the party opposite is unbelievable.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Those of us who've had the privilege of visiting some of the overseas territories or meeting with their representatives here in Westminster are very much aware of how strong their loyalty and admiration is towards the United Kingdom. Even if they've heard what the Foreign Secretary said this afternoon, perhaps they're right to have a nagging doubt that that loyalty will not be returned, aren't they?
Yeah. Let me just say to the honourable gentleman, because there's seriousness, of course, behind his question. All of us believe in the right to self-determination. And I unequivocally am absolutely clear that the overseas territories remain an important part of our national story, and nothing we have done in this deal puts them in any jeopardy.
Alistair.
Given the exploitive response of Argentina in the context of the Falklands, isn't it clear that those with malevolent aspirations about British territory are drawing comfort from the belief created by this deal that this government is weak on the question of sovereignty? And doesn't that come off the back of the fact that Westminster, within the United Kingdom, surrendered sovereignty over 300 areas of law in Northern Ireland to a foreign parliament, namely the European Parliament? If the Foreign Secretary wants to demonstrate that his assurances to Gibraltar and the Falklands are to be taken seriously, then shouldn't he begin by reclaiming sovereignty over all of the United Kingdom and reversing the surrender of sovereignty over 300 areas of law in Northern Ireland?
Well, can I say to you, we will always defend the Falkland Islands, and that point I raised with the Foreign Secretary for Argentina just last week in New York.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the mid-1960s, Foreign Secretary, when Mauritius was granted independence, they agreed, as part of that deal, to relinquish all claims to this British sovereign territory that we've owned since 1814, the Treaty of Paris. Why do you see fit to do a deal with a nation that has reneged on a previous deal, and why are we selling a sovereign asset of great value that we all agree for no money up front? We're paying them. It's negligent.
Because we've done a deal that secures the security of the global community. And I've got to say, I can't recall if the honourable gentleman is legally qualified, but I've got to tell him that we found ourselves with no one supporting our claim in the family of the UN and the rules-based order, and for that reason the last government began these negotiations, and it's been absolutely right that we conclude them.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the Foreign Secretary has made a very clear point, but Madam Deputy Speaker, in 1982 Margaret Thatcher set a precedent that the United Kingdom would do everything necessary to defend our overseas territories. So some 42 years later, it's important that these legacies are carried on. So can the Foreign Secretary commit to ensuring that this decision has no bearing on other overseas territories such as the Falklands or Gibraltar? I have many friends who live in the Falklands and Gibraltar. So what steps will be taken to protect and preserve them?
Yes, I can, and in that regard I'd want to associate myself with the remarks of the former Prime Minister and state once again that the right to self-determination governs our relationship with the overseas territories. They remain a very important part of our national story, and nothing in this deal undermines that important relationship, and that is why the Governor of the Falklands and Fabian Picardo in Gibraltar have been very clear about that in the last few days.
The honourable gentleman, I don't think, was standing throughout the statement. Could we just have a moment for the two front benches to swap over?